The Soldiers of Ares. Chapter 1. Mars was one of the 12 great Olympian kingdoms. It was a large kingdom which owed most of its size to war and conquest. In fact, it was called the war capital of the world. It was ruled by the Olympian god Ares. Ares was called the god of war, and with good reason. His strength and ferocity were legendary, and he found conquest and tributes to be the best form of income for his country. The name of Mars's capital city was Thrace. In the center of the city was Ares' castle, a huge fort covered in red and iron. There were more guns and weapons protruding from it than most armies had in their arsenals. Surrounding the castle were the huge barracks and residential units of the higher officers. All these were quite grand, as Lord Ares poured most of its funds into his army. The problem was that this left the rest of the country to rot. On the outskirts of the city were the slums. There were nothing more than unpaved roads with old and cramped buildings on either side. These buildings housed the poorer sections of the city, which largely consisted of soldiers who were no longer fit for wars. Along with the houses, the slums also acted as one of the world's biggest black markets. Anything could be bought here for the right price. The shops were littered with old weapons, defected magic gems, and monster organs, most of which could not be trusted. On the left end of the cellar street was an old, abandoned-looking building. The building was 3 stories high and looked as if the next storm would take it down. On the top of the building in the attic there lived a boy named Maximus. Maximus was 17 years old. His friends called him Max. He didn't have a last name because he was an orphan of war. He never knew his parents or even their names. He wasn't sure if they were dead or alive. All he knew was from his farthest memories he was always an orphan. But this didn't bother him too much. There were plenty of orphans in the slums, if both the parents died in the army. And there was no one left to take care of the child. They would be sent to an orphanage in the slums where they could only stay till the age of 12. Following that, the army took them in and trained them as soldiers till the age of 14, after which they were thrown into war. Then it was 3 years of compulsory service, after which they had a choice of staying in the army or leaving. Most would stay, as being a soldier was the major occupation in Mars. Also, by then, following orders were all they understood. Well, that and killing. But Maximus had chosen to leave the army, which meant that he was thrown into the slums with nothing but the clothes he wore. A decision he was regretting as he lay awake in the attic that day. It had been 7 months since Maximus had turned 17 and left the army and entered the slums. And he had adapted quickly to the new surroundings, though it had been tough in the beginning. With no money and no one willing to hire him, the only way to make a living was by getting something to trade. And that was how his life as a scavenger had started. Scavengers were what the people of Mars called those who went to the outskirts to hunt or gather things. They would bring back what they got, and the shops would pay them depending on the loot. It meant that some days nothing useful would be found, but at least they could gather food for themselves. Maximus had gotten ready to leave for the outskirts, but he knew it would be a waste. Some new monster had entered their hunting grounds, which had scared off their usual hunt, which meant that the only thing left for scavenging were some fruits and maybe some herbs. Either way, Maximus knew he had to at least try or would have to starve tonight. Maximus took a look at his condition. The building he was staying in was abandoned, and the first 2 floors were infested with rats, spiders, and pixies. In fact, the only part of the building that was not covered in dust and rubble was the attic. But the stairs that led to it were long gone. Maximus had to enter it via a rope which he had tied to a pillar inside. And this led to the ground through the back window. In the attic, he didn't have much. There was a bed on one side. Of course, bed here meant a bunch of torn blankets and old pillows he had sewn together the best he could. It wasn't very comfortable, but it beat sleeping on the ground. There was an old dresser in a corner which was in the attic when he first found it. He kept what little clothes he had in it. There were also a few utensils scattered around, and some firewood in the corner. The building no longer had electricity, but the pipes still worked, and Maximus had managed to fix one up to the attic. Other than that, the only things he owned were his scavenging equipment, a travel bag where he kept his loot, a small pouch with emergency herbs, combat boots, a pair of gloves, and a leather arm guard, which he had made himself from the hides of his kills. Other than that, they had a sword. It was old and chipped in places, not really sharp either, but it was the only one he could afford. Maximus had specialized in close-range sword and shield melee when he was in the army, but they didn't let you keep any weapons once you left. The only thing you could keep was your dog tag and a small 7-inch knife. The knife had 3rd 75 millions inscribed on its handle. The 2 stood for the 3rd Battalion, 75 was his number within the battalion, and M stood for the melee unit. The knife would have fetched him a good price in the market, but he liked holding on to it. This was everything he owned. He also had one other thing, something which he wasn't sure was his. He kept it in the bottommost shelves in his dresser, what he had named as the Cursed Blade. It was a sword he had found when he was still in the army. It was long and seemed to be of great power and quality, but Maximus had never seen the blade yet. This was because the entire blade and its sheath were covered in thick white wraps, seemed to be made out of parchment. At the point where the hilt started was a talisman with symbols he had never seen before. It didn't take him long to figure out that the talisman held some powerful magic which prevented it from being opened. The wrap wouldn't come off no matter how hard he pulled, and it couldn't even be cut by a soldier's knife. He had taken it to a local shaman in hopes of removing the talisman, but he asked for an exuberant amount of money to do it, money which he did not have. The sword couldn't even be sold to a seller because they couldn't check if it was worth something. Of course, Maximus did not know any of this when he first found it in the ruins of a temple just 3 months before he left the army. He had found it in a secret basement under the ruins and knew that if he took it to his superiors, he would never see it again. Instead, he left it there so that he could come and get it when he left the army. He was planning to sell it to get enough money to get started with his life, but his plan backfired when he realized he wouldn't be able to sell it. So now he was just stuck with it, sitting in the corner of his shelf, and since it had ruined all his plans, he had begun to call it cursed. Maximus checked if the blade was still there. Then he grabbed his equipment and went down the rope to reach the ground floor. He had to meet a scavenging partner by 8, and it was already getting late. This was his usual routine. They always met at an old pub by the road called the Loose Cannon. It was quite a popular place among the scavengers, hunters, and travelers among the trenches. The trenches were what everyone called the slums. It didn't have an original name as it wasn't in the original plans of the city. It was built by the city outcasts, and somewhere along the way, people started calling it the trenches, and the name just stuck. Maximus had just reached the entrance of the Loose Cannon when he heard the familiar voice of his partner greet him, "You're late, runt." Maximus wasn't actually a runt, quite the opposite. He was nearly 6 feet tall and pretty well built owing to his time in the army. He had dark black hair and matching black eyes. He kept his hair short, like most soldiers in the army. He no longer had to keep it that way, but he was so used to having it short that he did not bother changing it. He couldn't grow any sort of facial hair, though, which bothered him a little. He was a little to the lean side, which served him well as it made him more agile and flexible with the sword. But he was in no way a runt, but then again almost everyone seemed like a runt to his partner. For one thing, he was a minotaur. Minotaurs were one of the many races that inhabited the earth, along with humans, centaurs, satyrs, nymphs, and many others, which made up the world community. Minotaurs were half bull, half human creatures who usually stood well over 7 feet. They looked like bulls that had learned to walk on their hind legs. They were well known for their strength and horns. In fact, minotaur horns were quite valuable but were illegal to sell. But a few still somehow found their way into the black market sometimes. Maximus turned to his partner and said, "What, you started missing me already?" with a grin. His name was Rex, and like all minotaurs, that was it. All minotaurs had very short names like Zod, Gib, or Bob. Rex was well over 7 feet tall and had dark brown skin and fur covering his body, but minotaurs were like that. They weren't big on combing or shaving. He wore a pair of yellow and green camouflage pants that matched his eye, which was also a dull yellow shade. He didn't wear any shoes, as his hooves were tougher than Max's combat boots. He also didn't wear any shirt. It wasn't part of their culture or something. Unless it was armor or something, defensive minotaurs usually walked around bare-chested, and Rex was no exception. Maximus never really understood any of this, but when Rex had explained, he just nodded along. Rex was pretty menacing looking, or he would have been if there wasn't just half of him there. You see, Rex had also been part of the army, and unlike Maximus, he had planned to stay till he died. But all that changed when he came back to the barracks one day seriously wounded and bleeding. He had survived, but not entirely. He lost his left arm, eye, and horn that day. After that, he was forced to leave the army. After all, half a soldier would only be a liability on the battlefield. Or at least that's what the superiors thought. But Maximus had seen Rex fight while they were scavenging, and he was still scarier than most of the soldiers he had seen. But no matter how many times Maximus asked, he still never told him how he had gotten wounded so badly. "Come on, Max. I told you to get here a bit early. You know the pickings are scarce right now," Rex said. "I know," Max replied, "but I really don't think those 5 minutes are going to make a difference." "Shows what you know, you runt," Rex said. "But at least you bought all your stuff, right?" Max nodded and checked to see if Rex had bought all his weapons as well. When he was in the army, his weapon of choice was a huge battle hammer that literally shook the earth with each strike. But ever since he lost his arm, he had to shift to a smaller one-handed sledgehammer. The hammer in question was still bigger than a bowling ball. Other than that, he had a pistol and his army knife fastened to his belt. The knife had VE 52 hours inscribed on it, where H stood for the Heavy Weapons Division. He still wore his army dog tag around his neck. They started walking towards the entrance to their hunting grounds. But when they reached the stone gates which separated the trenches from the outskirts, they saw a huge crowd gathered there. Rex moved forward and asked a fellow scavenger what was going on. "The soldiers ain't letting no one to the grounds," the man said. "Say it's off limits for now. They figured out what the new monster is," another one chipped in. "It's a bloody manticore." Now this was really surprising news. Manticores were really ferocious beasts, very hard to track and even harder to kill. A manticore was a monster with the head of a lion, the tail of a scorpion, 6 legs and the size of an elephant. Maximus had never seen one himself, but had heard about them from other soldiers. There were 3 types: the ground manticores, winged manticores, and the emperor manticores. Maximus asked around what type it was. "It's a ground manticore, a pretty big one too. It attacked 4 hunters yesterday. Only 1 person survived, and he's in really bad shape," a centaur hunter told him. Centaurs were another very common race in the kingdom of Mars. They were creatures who had the top half of a human and the bottom half of a horse. This meant that there were 4 legs instead of just 2. This made them really fast runners. They were also excellent marksmen with all sorts of long-range weapons such as crossbows and guns. In fact, a large part of the army's long-range division consisted of centaurs due to their outstanding aim. Maximus headed back to Rex to see their next move. "So what do we do now?" he asked. "Not much we can do, is there?" Rex answered, "Since the army's barricaded the main entrance, we'll have to slip out some other way. But I think that we should maybe head back to the cannon for now and see what the others are up to." Maximus nodded in agreement. If you ever needed information about anything happening in the trenches, the Loose Cannon was the place to go. It was by far the most famous pub here in the trenches, and was always crawling with travelers and hunters, which meant that a lot of information got passed around here. Also, it was a great place to pick up work. The Loose Cannon had a huge bulletin board on one of its walls. People would put up requests on these walls and offer rewards to those who completed them. As they reached the entrance of the cannon, they noticed it was crowded as usual. Like most buildings in the trenches, the Loose Cannon was also a run-down old place. The paint was faded, and the wooden doors seemed like a good kick would break them. The windows were already broken from the countless number of bar fights that happened there. It also had an iconic century-old cannon placed outside near the entrance. The cannon hadn't been fired for years. In fact, one of its wheels was broken, and there was a cat sleeping in its barrel right now. Maximus and Rex entered, and the place was crowded and noisy as usual. There was some old violin music being played from an old jukebox in the corner, but it was barely audible over the shouting, singing and drunk laughing of its customers. There was a group of really loud and drunk satyrs, half man, half goat, in one corner. 2 humans, a minotaur and a dwarf, were playing poker in another. A fully cloaked man with a hood covering his face sat at the bar table. There were some soldiers on another table, but they didn't care about the mess around them. A centaur was even hustling some travelers at darts. Over at the table pouring drinks to his customers was Roderick. Roderick Evans was the owner and bartender of the Loose Cannon. He was a retired soldier from the army who had been in many wars and had the battle scars to prove it. He had left the army after the death of his wife, who had also served in his division. Now he had a quieter life in the trenches, and he was pretty well respected around here. Taking the drinks that he poured to the customers was his daughter Kayla. Kayla Evans was another reason Maximus loved coming to this pub, even though he didn't even drink. He had a huge crush on her from the first time they met. She was a brunette with her hair at just enough length for a ponytail, which she usually kept in a knot while she worked. Her skin was a bit tanned, and her eyes were hazel-colored. To Maximus, she was the most beautiful girl he had ever seen, even more beautiful than Empress Aphrodite, an Olympian goddess who ruled the kingdom of Venus. She was considered the prettiest woman in the world, and had even won the Miss World contest every time she participated, which was 8 times. Of course, Maximus never told Kayla any of this. For one thing, they were friends, and he was worried that if he said anything, he would lose that. For another, her father, Roderick, scared the crap out of him. Maximus watched as she moved from table to table. He was just thinking if this was what angels looked like when a sudden thump on the back of his head brought him back to reality. This was Rex, of course, and he said, "Yeah, I can keep staring at her after we get to our seats," with a wide grin on his scarred face. Maximus scowled and followed him to the bar stool where Roderick was serving drinks. Rex sat down at the bar table, and Maximus sat beside him. The only other person there at the table was a cloaked man who sat silently sipping his drink. This didn't bother them, as strange travelers were a common sight in the pub. "What will it be, boys?" Roderick asked. "Ox toxin for me, Roderick," Rex answered, "and I guess the runt will have baby milk or something." Maximus gave Rex a punch on his shoulder for this remark, which just made Rex grin more. See, Maximus didn't drink alcohol. He had tried it a few times, but he didn't quite enjoy it. In fact, he didn't even get a buzz. so he stuck to regular drinks, but it gave Rex an excuse to laugh at him. "Root beer is fine for me, thanks," he told Roderick. "A fine choice, Max. I think I'll have the same," said a familiar voice from behind. Maximus knew the voice well, as it belonged to a friend of his, Hedger. Hedger glided in and sat in the seat next to Maximus, and Hedger literally did glide in on his wings as he was a sprite. Sprites were another race of creatures that existed in the world, though not that common in Mars. They were small and usually just 3 to 4 feet tall. They also had a long tail which sort of acted as an extra hand. Their heads were shaped like dogs, complete with pointy ears and a snout. But what made sprites really special were their wings. Sprites had long and colorful wings which allowed them to fly, but not as good as birds or any such thing. The color of the wings tended to define a sprite, and their surnames were based on it. Since Hedger's wings were green, his name was Hedger Greenwing. The feathers were commonly used in magic, and different colors had different properties. Hedger was a salesman, well, kind of. What he usually did was buy useless stuff for a cheap rate and sell it to unwitting travelers, saying it was something useful. His most famous one being convincing a group of orcs that a common blue bird's egg was that of a phoenix. So in short, he was a con man. But despite all this, he was a really good friend of Maximus, and sort of a friend of Rex. Rex always complained that he talked too much, but Maximus knew that Hedger's heart was in the right place, and he was sure even Rex would agree. "Hey Max, you know what would go great with a root beer?" Hedger said. Maximus knew that this was his usual start to a sales pitch, so he answered, "Whatever piece of garbage you're selling today." "That's exactly right," Hedger said with a grin. "That is, if you consider minced chimera meat as garbage." Rex snorted loudly and asked, "So you just happened to walk past a dead chimera, did you? Or maybe you killed it yourself?" "I'm sorry, I don't recall asking Mr. Half-a-Cow for his words of wisdom," Hedger replied with his tongue out. "Knock it off, Hedger," Maximus said. "Come on, what is it really?" "Some sort of rodent, I think, but it's edible. I got it off a couple of dwarfs who were barbecuing it," Hedger said. "But no one's buying." Hedger took a sip of root beer and continued, "Tell you what, I'll give you half if you cook it for me." But before Maximus could reply, or Rex could make a snide remark, a voice interrupted from behind, saying, "Are you trying to tell me you just hauled some dead rat into my restaurant?" It was Kayla. She had returned to the table after delivering her orders. She was wearing a tattered t-shirt and jeans, which would have suited a boy more, and an apron she wore at work. The apron's original white color could barely be seen because it was covered in so many stains. She also had a sharp and annoyed look in her eyes directed at Hedger, and Maximus still thought she looked beautiful. "Apologies, my lady," Hedger said with a slight grin and a bow. "Yeah, well, just don't take it out in my restaurant," Kayla replied. Kayla was the only one who called the place a restaurant. It was what her father had originally planned, but the trenches were a place more suited for a pub than a fancy restaurant. Kayla poured another glass of ox toxin for Rex and continued, "Honestly, Dad, why do we still serve these idiots?" "Because idiots are our best customers," Roderick replied with a slight smile. "Anyway, since the 3 musketeers are here, I think I'll take my break." She pulled up a chair and sat beside them. This was all part of a regular day, only this was usually after Maximus and Rex had returned from scavenging. "So no one's going to the outskirts, huh?" Isla asked, resting her head on her hands. Rex nodded in agreement. "Not until the manticore is taken care of." "So I heard," Roderick added. "Is the army going to do something about that?" "Yeah, right," Maximus said. "Unless it attacks the city or something, the army's not going to lift a finger. We are on our own." The livelihood of the trenches was not exactly top priority in the kingdom. Maximus knew that the only way the army would get involved was if a reward was issued. Roderick said what he was thinking. "Guess we'll have to put up a reward." By we, Roderick meant the Sellers' Council. It was something like the unofficial government of the trenches. It consisted of almost all the shop owners in the trenches, including Roderick. "The rewards have got to be high if they want people to risk fighting a manticore," Rex said. Roderick nodded in agreement, but before he could reply, a voice said, "Another round, please." The cloaked man sitting beside them had just finished his drink. Roderick said, "You drank enough to drown a cyclope. Is you sure you want another?" The cloaked man just nodded. After he took his drink, he asked, "So, is there no way to get past the barricades?" Maximus realized that he must have overheard them talking, but he still didn't understand why he was so interested. "Not until the manticore is dealt with. There will probably be a reward on its head by tomorrow, but since the army blocked off the entrance, only soldiers will be allowed to pass to the outskirts. Unless someone just happens to know a hidden shortcut," Rex said with a grin and a wink with his one good eye. "Anyway, if you're searching for work, try the jobs bulletin board," Roderick continued. "All the details will be there." The cloaked man just finished his drink and thanked him. Then he got up and left. "Well, what's our plan?" Maximus asked. Do we take a path to the outskirts? Rex scratched his chin. This was his thinking pose. After a while he said, not today, the soldiers will be on high alert due to the attacks. We'll sneak outside tomorrow. Besides, I still got some food left from the last hunt, and you got Hedger's rat to fill our bellies for today. Then he finished off his drink, picked up his bag and hammer, and left. Guess it's just you and me, buddy, Hedger said, and they were just about to leave when Kayla called them and handed Maximus a small basket of potatoes and olives. Here, she said. They are a bit old, but they haven't gone rotten yet. It should add some flavor to whatever's in Hedger's bag. She gave one last smile and went to the kitchen. Maximus just stood there watching her go. She was so kind, he thought to himself, and hard-working, not to mention beautiful. But his daydreams were cut short when Hedger cleared his throat loudly and said, "Come along, Maxie. You got that I'm a lovesick kitten look on your face again." Maximus scowled at him, and then they headed back to his place. Maximus climbed the rope back up to his place while Hedger just flew in the window. It was already evening, and the day had been really unproductive. Maximus thought it would be impossible to escape this hellhole if things didn't get better. He wanted to get out of here, and not just the trenches but the entire country of Mars. He had heard there were other countries where the lifestyle was more peaceful, or where technology had gotten so advanced people didn't even have to work anymore, and other places that were so magical that it was like being on another planet. Maximus started cooking while Hedger flew around picking firewood from the nearby trees. Maximus liked cooking and he was pretty good at it, but this wasn't something he shared with everyone. A guy could get mocked to death for saying he liked cooking in the army. The trenches weren't any better, but he felt calm when he cooked. And when he was done, Hedger remarked that it smelled great. "So what do you call it?" he asked. "I guess we could call it stewed rat with potatoes," Maximus replied. Hedger scowled and said, "You know I said rodent, didn't I? Not rat, but rodent. There is a difference." "Fine stewed rodent with potatoes," Maximus said. "That any better?" Hedger took a bite off his plate and said, "Not really, but it tastes great. Now if we call it chicken, then I say we got something to sell." Maximus also took a bite, and he's pretty pleased with his work. "I don't see why you can't just go and cook at the cannon. They could use you," Hedger said. Maximus had had this conversation with him before, but even though he liked cooking, he still felt he was a warrior at heart, and spending all day in a kitchen just wasn't for him. "You know why, so stop asking," Maximus said. But Hedger didn't drop it. He said, "Oh, come on, it's perfect. We would never have to eat rats again, plus you could spend all day with Kayla." And then he made a few kissing sounds. Maximus chucked a rat bone at him, which he flicked off with his tail. "I'm a good scavenger, and I'll stay at that, and I really wish you and Rex would stop mocking me with Kayla. The last thing I need is for her to hear that and ban me from the cannon." Hedger glided around and put the dirty plates into the sink. He said, "You're right. Better guys than you have tried and failed with her." This was a fact Maximus knew too well. Till now, Kayla had turned down every guy who had ever asked her out, and most of these guys were older and usually better looking than him. Once, even a dashing young captain from the army had asked her out, and she still said no. Needless to say, Max's chances with her were slim to none. Although, Hedger started saying, "She might start seeing you in a different light if you did something ridiculously heroic." Maximus narrowed his eyes and looked at his friend. He knew Hedger was up to something, so he asked, "And what heroic deed do you have in mind exactly?" "Nothing too fancy, just maybe slay a manticore," Hedger said. Maximus let out a small laugh. They had talked about doing things like this before, fighting monsters and saving cities, but they were just stories, not something he had any real intention of doing. Going up against a fully grown ground manticore would be suicide. "Sounds like fun," Maximus said, "but I think my rusty old blade would break before I even made a dent on its armor." "But you do have another blade, don't you?" Hedger said. Maximus knew he was talking about the cursed blade. Hedger was convinced that the blade was a very powerful weapon. He said it was a sprite's intuition. Sprites were more in tune with magic than humans, but Maximus still didn't know how a blade he couldn't even unsheath would be useful in battle. "Tell you what," Hedger continued, "why don't you take the blade with you tomorrow, and maybe it might work against the manticore." "I think the idea is to avoid the manticore, Hedger," Maximus said. "Now stop daydreaming and get some sleep. You can spend the night here." Hedger finally dropped it and decided sleep wasn't such a bad idea. He flew in circles for a while and finally hung his tail on a metal beam and went to sleep. This was how sprites slept, upside down, hanging on their tails like bats. Maximus also turned in for the night, but somehow what Hedger said just didn't leave his mind. The Soldiers of Ares, Chapter 2. The next morning, Maximus had gotten up really early. The plan was to slip out early, in hopes that the soldiers wouldn't have started their patrols by then. He managed to wake Hedger up as well and drag him outside, but it looked like just the sight of a comfy pillow would send him back to dreamland. He had told Rex to meet them in front of the cannon, but when they reached the street he was already waiting there. He wasn't alone either. At least a dozen people were also standing there staring at the same piece of paper. "What's going on?" Maximus asked Rex. Rex just snorted and stood there for a few seconds. Then he said, "The reward for the Manticore is out, 400 gold pieces." That finally woke Hedger up. "Did you say 400 golden beauties? Man, the Sellers Council really wants this thing gone." Maximus was also surprised at the reward. He had never seen such a high bounty before in the trenches. Then again, they never had to deal with such a strong monster before. The world's money system was easy enough to understand. 10 pieces of bronze made a silver piece, and 10 silver pieces made a gold piece. This was the same under all the Olympian kingdoms under the order of the god King Zeus. And 400 gold pieces were a lot, at least in the trenches. With that kind of money, a person could really restart his life. But he knew that the risk was too great. But then again, he had already done something today against his rational instincts. He had brought along with him the cursed blade. They started to move towards the east part of the trenches. There was an old junkyard at the end of it. It was a place where a lot of the kingdom's scrap metal got sent, and in Mars, a large portion of these included war vehicles such as tanks, jeeps, and armored cars. After anything useful was taken from a destroyed vehicle, whatever was left was hauled off to the junkyard. Out towards the back, where the larger vehicle shells were stored, there was a small opening which led to some underground caves that in turn led to the outskirts. The caves seemed to be built by dwarves but had been abandoned for years. Dwarves were an underground dwelling race. They were also natural-born excavators. They had powerful front claws that were excellent for digging, and they also had a keen sense of smell so that they could navigate the tunnels even without light. Dwarves also made the best blacksmiths, mechanics, and building constructors. Anything that needed building or fixing was their thing. Maximus had read somewhere that most of the dwarven population resided in the kingdom of Vulcan, but you saw quite a few in Mars as well. The problem was that dwarves only grew to about 3 feet tall, which made most of the tunnels inaccessible to them, especially for a big guy like Rex. But a few of the tunnels were made to move equipment, and they were big enough for Rex to squeeze and crawl his way through. Obviously, he wasn't looking forward to this. "Damn it, wish the army would just take out that Manticore instead of blocking off the entrance," Rex said. But Maximus knew that wouldn't happen. The outskirts just weren't considered as valuable territory. There was no way the army would waste resources there. And even though the blocking of the entrance was an annoyance to scavengers and sellers, he knew that a lot of people slept better at night knowing that the army was guarding the entrance. Hedger glided down to shoulder level from a tree. He was munching on an apple. He tossed one each to Maximus and Rex. He took another bite and said, "If anyone has the right to complain here, it's me. I can't believe you guys talked me into doing this again." Hedger didn't usually join them on their scavenging hunts, but the dwarf tunnels were way too complex and it was easy to get lost or stuck. Neither Maximus nor Rex could go through them easily. That's where Hedger came in. He was small enough to fit through all the tunnels and lead the way for them. But he hated this more than Rex did, as he couldn't use his wings there. And not being able to spread his wings made Hedger kind of claustrophobic. As they reached the entrance of the junkyard, a familiar metallic smell surrounded them. Maximus liked the junkyard. It was filled with old relics of the past, each broken piece of equipment here had a story to tell, and most would be great war stories. When he was still in the army, he used to admire the tanks and other battle machines used by the army. He always preferred his sword, but it was hard not to feel the power radiate from a RAM tank. The RAMs, or the Region Annihilation Megatanks, were the army's ultimate weapon. Those double-barreled megatanks could probably even take out a ground manticore without a scratch. As they started walking through the junkyard, Maximus noticed that Rex wasn't really joining in the conversation and he had a serious look on his face. "What's wrong?" he asked Rex. He didn't respond right away. Then in a low voice he said, "I think we're being followed." Maximus turned around slowly to take a look, but he didn't see anyone. The junkyards were almost always empty. Somehow the rusty machinery didn't exactly make it an attractive hangout spot. "I don't see anyone," Maximus said. "Neither do I," Hedger said in agreement. But Rex still seemed unconvinced. "I don't know, somehow I feel it in my snout. Maybe you just got a bug or something stuck in there. Your nose is sure big enough for it," Hedger said. "Guess your instinct isn't just what it used to be." But before Rex could respond to that with some rather unconventional words, a voice said, "I wouldn't say that." Maximus looked around to find the source of the voice when Hedger tugged at his shirt and pointed to the top of a pile of scrap metal. A man stood there, and he slowly walked down the scrap pile to meet them. Maximus didn't recognize him at first, but then he realized that it was the same cloaked man from yesterday. It was Rex who reacted first. He pulled out his gun and pointed it at the man and said, "You're the guy from the pub yesterday. Why are you following us?" For a guy with a gun pointed at his head by a 7-foot minotaur, he seemed pretty calm. His face was still covered by his hood, and only his chin and mouth were visible. His expression hadn't changed a bit. But then the man said, "Your experience in tracking with your nose. I'm guessing you and the boy are ex-military." This was true, of course. Minotaurs and other races with a keen sense of smell were taught special tracking methods related to smell, and Rex had undergone it too. What Maximus didn't understand was how the man understood that he used to be a soldier as well. Rex narrowed his eyes and asked, "What's it to you?" The man still didn't seem bothered by the gun pointed at his face, and this was starting to bother Maximus. Then the man said, "I don't care about your past. What I do care about is a piece of information you let slip yesterday. You mentioned there was another way into the outskirts." "Eavesdropping isn't very polite, Mr. Hood," Hedger said. "So why don't you start by telling us who you are?" "Actually, Mr. Hood is just fine," he said, and Hedger had no response to that. Maximus was trying to figure out anything he could about this man, but it was hard since his cloak covered his entire body. Even his feet and shoes were covered in wraps. But Maximus could tell that he had a sword on his waist under his cloak. The fact that he wasn't unarmed wasn't that encouraging. "Rex, put the gun away. I don't think he's going to attack us," Maximus said. Then he turned to the hood man and asked, "Why do you want to go to the outskirts so badly anyway?" The man turned to Maximus. Maximus was kind of amazed at how expressionless his face still looked. He had seen more feelings on a stone statue. "My reasons are not important to you, but I can make it worth your while," the man said. And then he put his hand in his pocket and took out 3 gold pieces and showed them to the trio. "These are yours if you can get me outside." This sure got their attention. "A piece of gold each for just letting him tag along doesn't seem so bad," Hedger said. Maximus had to agree it was a sweet deal, but he wasn't stupid enough to trust a guy who wouldn't even show his face. Rex seemed to be thinking along the same lines. He said, "And are we just supposed to blindly trust you?" The man lowered his head and said, "I give you my word that I will not attack any of you unless I am attacked first. Besides, shouldn't I be the one who should worry? After all, there are 3 of you and you are well armed." "Don't think that we haven't noticed the sword you're hiding under your cloak," Maximus said. "Yes, but I assure you that is all I have," the man said. "Unlike you, I have no firearms." Maximus wasn't too relieved by this. He knew that a swordsman with proper training and a powerful enough sword could easily take care of a group of gunmen. And his instincts told him that this man had both. Rex looked to Maximus. Even though Maximus didn't trust this guy, the money he was offering was good, and they could really use it, so he nodded in agreement. "Fine," Rex said. "You can tag along, but at the first sight of any funny business, I am personally putting a bullet in your head." The man nodded in agreement. His face didn't show any signs of worry that he had just been threatened, or any signs of life at all for that matter. Then Rex held out his only arm, and the hooded man shook on it. After that, they started walking to the cave entrance together. Maximus was pretty sure he had never been part of a more silent group. Even Hedger wasn't opening his big mouth. It was Rex who finally spoke. "So who the hell are you anyway?" Maximus felt that Rex was being a bit rude, but it didn't seem to bother the hooded man. Instead, he asked, "What happened to your arm and eye?" Rex snorted angrily at this and said, "That's really none of your business. Then I don't think my identity is any of your concern either," replied the man. Needless to say, there was no more small talk after that. They finally reached the caves and Hedger began to lead the way. The rest of them followed close behind. Hedger could easily fit through all the caves, but it was clear to Maximus that he didn't like not being able to use his wings. But at least he didn't have to crawl around on all fours like the rest of us, Maximus thought to himself. The caves were excruciatingly annoying for Rex, who was bringing up the rear. Even though he was curled up into a ball and moving at the speed of a snail, he was still just barely getting through. Once he even managed to get his horns stuck on a tree root that was sticking out, and that just made his day. After about 20 minutes or so of torturous crawling, they finally saw the light at the end of the tunnel and were thrilled that their little maze was over. They finally got out, but they still had aching knees and dirt all over them. "I don't care if we gotta break down the barricade, but we have to find another way back," Rex complained. Maximus couldn't help but grin at this, mainly because they had finally reached the outskirts. It was true that scavengers didn't get much pay and the job was a lot of hard work, but nobody ever said that the job was boring. There was something truly exhilarating about being out there and hunting in the wild. The 3 of them finally turned to the hooded man. Rex said, "Well, here you are, the great outdoors. So if you could just hand over the money you promised, we will just be on our way." The man nodded in agreement. "I have a question though," he said. "There should be a trail nearby which off-road vehicles are supposed to use. Could you point me in its direction?" Maximus knew the trail he was talking about. There was only one such trail out here in the outskirts, and he had traveled it a few times when he was still in the army. He had been aboard a convoy on transport duty. The trail was not there in any of the maps, and the things that were transported through here by the army were usually illegal stuff that never appeared in any of the military records. Maximus wasn't proud of this, but he had seen and turned a blind eye to worse in the army. It's towards the north from here. Just keep walking till you reach a small incline. You should be able to see the trail from there, Maximus said. I have heard that there is a cliff there from which the trail is visible, he asked again. Maximus nodded and replied, Yeah, you should be able to spot the cliff within 5 minutes. The man nodded at this and handed over the money. Then he began to move towards the trail. How do you plan to get back to the city? Maximus asked as he began to walk away. The hooded man stopped for a second and said, I don't plan to, and began walking again down his path. Once the man was out of sight, Hedger said, Well, that was weird to say the least. Wonder what he's up to. Rex let out a small grunt and said, Who cares? He already paid us. He can go and jump in a lake for all I care. Now come on, we got work to do. They started to move through the trees to their usual scavenging spots, but somehow Maximus couldn't stop thinking about the hooded man. Come on, let's head to the taller trees first. Since Hedger is with us, he'll be able to get any fruits that are on top of them, Rex said. Maximus nodded, and they started to move towards the trees. Rex was still sore from being cramped up in the tunnel, so he wasn't in any mood to talk, and Hedger began chasing the moths that were flying around in the forest. This gave Maximus some time to think. They had reached the area of the outskirts where the trees grew really tall. Among these were some apricot trees. The apricots that grew here were really sweet and were considered a luxury in the trenches. They were sure to be able to sell them at a good price back in the city. Since Hedger could just fly around and pluck them, it didn't really leave Maximus and Rex anything to do. Maximus then started thinking about the time he was on transport duty. They were passing through the trail carrying a crate. The convoy just contained one armored car with 4 soldiers inside, including Maximus. They were never told what was in the crate during the briefing. All they were told was that it was for the good of the country and for the glory of General Ares. Maximus was smart enough to know that this meant that if he asked more questions, he would just attract trouble. The transport was going smoothly till it had reached the cliffs. That's when things started going bad. Their convoy was ambushed by a group of orcs. There were around 7 of them, but they weren't well trained enough to take them on, though they were easily dealt with. They managed to deliver the crate without trouble after that, and they were asked to never speak of the mission to anyone. That's when it finally hit Maximus. Hey, Rex, I was just wondering about that hooded guy, Maximus said. Rex gave Maximus an annoyed look. I already told you to let it go. I know, but listen, Maximus said impatiently. Didn't you think it was weird that he wanted to get to that trail? I mean, the only thing it gets used for is the shady transports which the army does. Yes, so, Rex said. Also, he was asking about the cliffs, right? Maximus asked. Rex's eyes slowly began to widen. Are you trying to tell me that man is trying to ambush an army convoy? Maximus slowly nodded. But that would be suicide. A convoy will have at least 3 men all heavily armed. Maximus knew Rex had a point, but his instincts told him that the man they had just met wasn't exactly ordinary. I know, but if he managed to pull it off, it would be the perfect crime. Those transports never went into any records. If he got off with whatever they were carrying, there's not much that could be done after. But even so, Rex had begun to say when Hedger flew in and dropped some apricots on him. Rex managed to catch them just in time. What are you ladies mumbling about? Hedger asked. Max thinks that the hooded guy's going to try to knock off an illegal military convoy. Maximus had already told the story of those transports to Hedger before, so he knew what they were talking about. I thought you said those convoys were heavily guarded, Hedger said. I mean, unless Mr. Hood is packing a few explosives under his cloak, what's he going to do? Maximus just stared at Hedger as if he had just told a horror story, and he knew Rex was also thinking the same thing. Hedger had just told about the explosives as a joke, but both Maximus and Rex saw it as a very real possibility. He was really keen about keeping his cloak on, Rex said nervously. It finally dawned on Hedger as well. Wait, are you guys seriously considering the possibility that he might try to bomb the convoy? The 3 of them just stood there silently for a while. Maybe they were just being paranoid, Maximus thought, but this was not something he could just ignore if people's lives were at stake. The Soldiers of Ares. Chapter 3. So what are you guys saying we should do? Hedger finally asked. It's not like it's any of our business. Rex shook his head and said, the fact that we are the reason he got here makes it our business. Besides, the people on that convoy are soldiers. Me and Max were once soldiers too, so we can't just ignore this. Maximus wasn't really that loyal to the army. He knew that the armies of Ares ran more of a dictatorship than a kingdom, and their great leader Ares was actually an overpowerful madman who enjoyed the war more than he enjoyed the victory. But he was also not willing to have any more blood on his hands, intentional or not. That was part of the reason he left the army. "Let's go and have a chat with our friend Mr. Hood," Maximus said, "and if he's up to what we fear, let's stop him." They moved as fast as they could to the cliff. When they got close enough, Hedger glided higher to see if he could spot anything. "Hey guys, I can see our hooded friend waiting on top of the cliff," he said. "And I think you called it right, Max. I can see some movement at the end of the trail. I think it might be a pair of military vehicles." "Is the guy armed?" Rex asked. "I can't see him lighting up any bombs if that's what you mean." Finally, they climbed to the top of the cliff Hedger just flew, and when they reached there, the man was already facing them. "Didn't expect to see you three again," he said. "Yeah, well, we were just wondering what you were doing all the way out here." "It's not exactly the place for a stroll," Hedger said. The man turned back to face the trail. The convoy which Hedger had spotted earlier was clearly visible now. And it wasn't just a single transport truck either. There were 2 armored cars along with it for security. Maximus realized that whatever was being transported must be pretty valuable. "So what is it that you think I am doing?" the hooded man asked. "Well, ambushing the military convoy heading our way with some explosives does come to mind," Maximus said. The man turned to look at him, but the expression on his face was still unchanged. "Well, you are only half correct," he said. "I do plan to attack that convoy, but sadly I don't have any explosives with me." Maximus was trying to figure out if this man was stupid or crazy. He was talking about taking on a heavily armed military convoy on his own and using what? Just his sword. But what worried Maximus was the confidence with which he said he would do it, as if it was nothing more than child's play. "You can see that we might not be very comfortable with letting you do that," Rex said. "After all, it's like you said we are ex-military." The man just looked at the ground. "I guess soldiers can't easily forget their loyalty even if it is to a sadistic tyrant such as Ares." He said this more to himself than to the others. Then he turned to Rex and said, "This is not your fight, so just walk away." But Rex pulled out his gun and pointed it at the man, then with a grin on face he said, "Sorry, I never learned how." For a second Maximus thought that it would end here without any further trouble, but he realized how wrong he was a few seconds later, because what happened next happened in a blur. In a flash, the man who was standing at least 7 feet across was suddenly right near their noses. And the only thing faster than him was his sword. Maximus didn't even remember seeing him draw his sword, but by the time he was in front of them, it was already in his hand. Then with one swift slash he took out Rex's gun. At first, Maximus thought he had just knocked the gun out of his hand until he realized that Rex was still holding the gun's handle. The man had actually chopped off the gun's muzzle in one strike. Now it was Max's turn, and before he could even reach for his sword, the man gave a kick on his chest. Maximus was thrown back by this. It was like being hit by a hammer more than a kick, like his foot was made of iron or something. Then, in another fluidic movement, he had his sword at Hedger's neck. Then he said, "Now, let's talk." As a swordsman, Maximus couldn't help but admire the man standing in front of him with a blade to his friend's neck. He had never seen such refined swordsmanship in his life. And there were some pretty good swordsmen in the army, but none of them had this kind of speed and precision. And his sword, now that he finally got a look at it, he couldn't call it anything lesser than a work of art. It was long and a bit broader than most blades, and it had no curves. Instead, the entire blade was straight and had sharp edges. The blade was silver, and the hilt was black. Also, the hilt looked like it had been designed for royalty. It had magnificent carvings on it. It had silver strands running across. It also had a dark blue gem at the place where the hilt and the blade met. Maximus knew that the sword was no ordinary weapon, and he had no doubt that the one wielding it was any different. After all, he had just taken out their entire party, and even his cloak hadn't come off. The man stood there with the blade still on Hedger's neck, but suddenly a rumble came from below them. The convoy had almost reached the bottom of the cliff. The man then sheathed his sword and said, "I don't have time for this." Then he took Hedger by the shirt and threw him across, straight at Rex with enough force to knock him to the ground. Then he jumped off the cliff, and amazingly just landed on his feet, or foot, as Maximus noticed that he let his left leg take most of the landing impact. Then he went and stood right in the middle of the trail waiting for the convoy. The 3 of them finally got to their feet. "What do we do now?" Hedger asked. Rex looked down at where the man was standing and said, "I guess we jump." Maximus did not approve of this idea. He went to the edge of the cliff to look at the drop. He was sure that he wouldn't die or anything, but he was also uncertain if he could walk away from it without a broken leg. Not sure if that's a good idea, Rex," he said. "Oh, come on now, we'll be fine," Rex said, and gave him a pat on his back. Too bad Maximus was standing a bit too close to the edge, and the Pat pushed him over it. In his panic, Maximus grabbed onto the only thing he could, which was Hedger's tail. Rex tried to catch them, but it was useless, and he just ended up hurtling down along with them. They fell as a ball of hands, wings, and hooves, and landed roughly on the ground. Maximus finally got up from that mess and checked to see if he was all right. Luckily, nothing was broken. Rex and Hedger got up too, and Hedger said, "Well, that was fun," shooting a dirty look at the other two. The man barely took notice of the commotion they made. Maximus couldn't blame him. With an entrance like that, they wouldn't have even scared a mouse. But Maximus had already decided that he was going to challenge the hooded man. Seeing him fight had stirred something inside him. Maximus was a good swordsman, but he knew that the man was better. But the thing was, he just couldn't resist trying to find out how much better. "Hey, hood guy," he said, drawing his sword. "Let's settle this man-to-man sword too. Sheath." Maximus had tried to pull out his sword from his backpack, but he had forgotten one thing. The fact that he had only bought his cursed blade along with him today. So when he tried to take out the sword, it came out of his bag with the sheath still intact. "Why the hell do you have that thing with you?" Rex said from behind. But Maximus didn't have time to reply as the army convoy had just reached them. The Soldiers of Ares. Chapter 4. Maximus could do nothing more than watch and see what unfolded next. The man had drawn his sword again and was still standing firmly in the middle of the trail. The convoy had already seen him, but it was evident that they had no plans of stopping. But this didn't seem to bother the man. Then he did something even more unexpected. He charged at the convoy. "That proves it. He is batshit crazy," Hedger said. Maximus agreed with Hedger. Charging straight at an armored car would just leave the man as roadkill. But at the last moment, just inches before he made contact with the car's front, he shifted to the left, and with his sword ripped straight through its side. The blade actually went through the metal, and it had completely destroyed the two tires as well. The car skidded out of control and stopped right in the middle of the road, which also made it impossible for the other two vehicles to pass. Maximus wondered if that was the plan all along. The other two vehicles stopped as well, and soldiers started pouring out from all of them. Maximus counted 10 in total, 6 humans, 3 satyrs, and 1 minotaur. One of the soldiers came forward. It was a woman, and she seemed to be the one in charge. She was lean, and her blonde hair was just visible under her helmet. She would have looked pretty if she didn't have an expression that said she would break the bones of anyone who crossed her. Maximus saw that she had a captain's badge on her chest. "That was quite the neat trick, swordsman," she said. "But it's going to take more than just the 4 of you to steal this transport." "Wait, what?" Maximus thought to himself. Did she just say the 4 of you, like they were working with this man? Maximus exchanged looks with Rex and Hedger. If they didn't clear this up, they could end up in a lot of trouble. "Excuse me," Hedger started to say, "but we are not with him." Before Hedger could complete his sentence, he had 3 guns pointed at him. "Quiet," the woman barked. "I don't converse with criminals." Then she signaled her men, and the soldiers had their guns pointed at the 4 of them. She said, "I am Captain Deborah, Sharp of the armies of Ares, and unless you want that to be the name of your executioner, I suggest you come quietly." Maximus had heard of Captain Sharp before. She was pretty famous within the army. If he remembered correctly, she was an experienced melee fighter, but he didn't remember what her weapon of choice was, and he couldn't spot anything on her. But the hooded man didn't seem to be interested in talking. Instead, he just readied his sword. Among the soldiers, 5 of them had rifles and 3 had their swords drawn. Only Captain Sharp and the Minotaur seemed to be unarmed. And now all of their weapons were pointed at the hooded man. "Now's our chance. Let's try to get out of here before things get messy," Rex muttered. Maximus didn't know if they could avoid the bullets if they started running, but it seemed to be the only chance they had. And so they ran. "Shoot them, you fools," Captain Sharp yelled. That was it. Maximus thought he was going to die here. He turned back to see his end. He figured if he was going to die, he would rather face it like a man than running away from it like a coward. But what he saw instead was the hooded man coming to their rescue. When Maximus turned, he saw all 5 guns pointed at them. But they never got a chance to fire, because a single slash had ripped through 3 of the barrels, cutting the rifles in half. With this, the other 2 gunmen thought it might be a smart idea to take care of the hooded guy first, but they had no luck. With another slash, one of the gunmen began bleeding heavily. And with another, the final gunner was disarmed. "What are you waiting for? Switch to your swords," Captain Sharp yelled. With that, all the 5 soldiers drew their swords, and the other 3 swordsmen joined in as well. "Lad," Captain Sharp said to the Minotaur, "you, go after the others." Lad the Minotaur seemed happy at this proposal. He had a stupid grin on his face like a child who had just gotten a new toy. Then he started chasing after them. When Lad got closer to them, Rex tried to talk to him. Listen, Laud, was it? We are not with him. We are just some scavengers who were nearby. Laud laughed at this. Oh, just a bunch of scavengers, huh? He said. Please, you gotta believe us. I mean, we're ex-military, Maximus said. Laud just laughed even harder at this. You think I care if you're military or scavengers or dog trainers? I just want someone to break. What? Rex asked, a bit confused. Oh, you get it right, Laud continued. You know how rare it is I get to break some bones. I mean, human bones break easy, but a fellow Minotaur is a real treat, even if there's only half of you left. Maximus could see the rage building up in Rex's eyes. He had his fist clenched around his hammer now. Then he said, I got a problem with guys like you. Then both Rex and Laud pointed their heads up, made a growl-like sounds, and snorted. Maximus knew what this meant. This was how Minotaurs issued a challenge to others. This had turned into a clash of pride, and Maximus knew that Rex wouldn't want him to interfere in this fight. Maximus tried to figure out what to do next as the two Minotaurs began to clash horns and throw their fists. Behind them, the hooded man was fighting 8 armed soldiers on his own, and the thing was, he was making it look easy. Most of the soldiers were already wounded or bleeding, but the man still didn't seem to have a scratch on him. Captain Sharp was still watching all this in anger. What now do we run? Hedger asked. Maximus didn't know what to do. He couldn't interfere with Rex's fight, and he definitely didn't want to run away. What he really wanted was to try and help the hooded man. After all, he had just saved their lives from the gunmen, and Maximus didn't want to be indebted to him. But he knew that would just worsen things with the army. Besides, it didn't seem like the man needed any help, as half of the soldiers were already on the ground. I don't know, Maximus said, but we can't just leave Rex here. Rex and Laud were at each other at full force. Even without an arm and an eye, Rex was still holding his own, which Laud really wasn't expecting. But Rex still couldn't find an opening to finish the job. Must I do everything myself? Captain Sharp said. Then she pushed her cape aside to reveal a green crystal on her shoulder. Maximus knew what it was. He had seen it before with some high-ranking officers. It was a summoning crystal, a magic crystal that could be used to summon an object to its position. Maximus didn't know exactly how it worked. All he knew was it could only work with inanimate objects. He also knew that most ranked officers in the army used it for storing powerful weapons. Sure enough, the captain tapped the crystal and muttered something under her breath, and the next second a huge spear appeared in her hands. Maximus knew from just looking at it that it was no ordinary spear. The spear consisted of a long wooden body with a metal blade at its head. What made it even more fearsome were the yellow sparks that kept buzzing at the tip. The captain then took her battle stance and the spearhead began glowing yellow. Oh man, did she just pull out an energy spear? Hedger said. Energy weapons were specialized weapons using technology or magic to add an extra punch in a battle. These were usually melee-type weapons, and in the hands of a trained professional could be more destructive than a tank. Well, I guess we'll find out just how good Mr. Hood really is, Maximus said. The captain started off with a bang. A quick jab with the spear sent a blast of energy hurling towards the hooded man. He still managed to dodge it. The captain was a much better fighter than the other soldiers, but the mystery man was better. He was managing to fend off Captain Sharp and 4 other soldiers on his own. But that's when one of the other soldiers finally gained consciousness. But instead of going for his sword, he went for one of the rifles that were still not broken. He aimed straight for the hooded man's head, and at a distance he couldn't miss. But before he could take a shot, Maximus banged him on the head with his sheathed sword. Maximus didn't know why he did that. Maybe he was just repaying the man for saving them earlier. Or maybe he just respected the man too much as a swordsman to let him be taken out by a bullet from behind. Either way, he knew that there was no backing out now, so he went to the man's side to help. What are you doing? The hooded man asked. I guess I really don't like being in debt, Maximus answered. Anyway, I'm here to help. Maximus began fighting alongside the man, which was a lot harder with a sheathed sword, but most of the soldiers were already wounded and tired so he could hold his own. Only Captain Sharp was the real problem. The man turned to him and said, if you really want to help go get what's in that transport to safety, I can hold them off here. Maximus nodded in agreement and ran to the back of the transport truck, while the man blocked anyone who tried to peruse him. As he reached the back of the truck, Hedger flew in to join him. What the hell do you think you're doing? Hedger asked. And when did you and Mr. Hood become best buds? Maximus didn't know what to say. I don't know, Hedge. I'm just going with my instinct here. Maximus stared at the lock on the transport. There was a big padlock on it, and he didn't know how to break it. Hedger was still ranting on about what Maximus had done. Would you just shut up and help me with this? Maximus said. Hedger stuck his tongue out at Maximus and looked at the lock. Then he sheepishly said, well, I might actually be able to help with that. He started searching his pouch and pulled out a long green feather with yellow inscriptions on it. It was also carved at the end. Quill key, Maximus said in surprise. From where did you get that? A quill key was a magically enhanced key that could be used to open most locks. It was quite rare as the ingredients for making it were hard to come by. They were also illegal, and one of the main ingredients was a long sprite wing feather. And judging by the shape and color of the feather used in this one, Maximus could tell it came from Hedger. Well, a warlock said he would pay good money for 5 of my longest feathers, Hedger began explaining. And he didn't have all the money he promised me with him, so he gave me one of his finished products instead. I thought you were against selling your feathers, Maximus shot back. Hedger stared at the ground and said, Yeah, well, business was kind of slow and morals don't exactly fill your stomach, do they, Max? Maximus understood why he did it, but he didn't like it. Just possessing that thing was illegal, much less producing it. If Hedger had been caught with that, the army would have branded him as a thief for sure. Look, can we please discuss my business ethics later? Like when we don't have soldiers who want to kill us just a few feet away and focus on the task at hand, Hedger said. Maximus nodded in agreement and took the quill key from him. He placed the tip of the quill in the keyhole and it started to glow. A few seconds later, the padlock was unlocked. Maximus started removing the bolt and Hedger said, Okay, now let's find out what all this fuss is about. Maximus didn't know what to expect inside, maybe gold or magic jewels, or some powerful weapon. But when Maximus finally opened the door, all he saw inside was a very thin and frail-looking old man in chains curled up in the corner. The man looked like he was at least 100 years old. His hair was long and gray, and he had an overgrown beard that was at least a week old. His clothes were torn and dirty. He also had a chain attached to the wall around his leg. Not that he seemed to be in any condition to run away, he just sat there in a corner muttering to himself, and as far as Maximus could tell, he hadn't even noticed that the doors had opened. So all this is for a dirty old man, Hedger said. Maximus was really confused now. Don't know, but he must be someone important, let's just ask him. Maximus went up to the old man and asked, Sir, who are you? No response. Sir, he said again. Still nothing. Then Maximus slowly put his hand on the old man's shoulder. The old man looked up so fast that it startled Maximus a bit. Then he said glaciers slowly melt as they travel from poles. Maximus didn't understand what he was talking about. Excuse me, he said. Jumping squirrels make nests in hollow trees, was the old man's reply to that. Is this guy off his rockers? Hedger asked. Light goes back to white when traveling through 2 prisms, was the old man's next quote. Yeah, he's definitely nuts, Hedger said. So all that fighting wasn't just for any old man, but for one that's crazier than a drunken unicorn. Whatever the case, we can't just leave him here, Maximus said. He had no idea what was going on, but he was pretty sure the army wasn't taking the old man to show him his retirement benefits. Maximus looked at the chain while the old man started talking about snowflakes, but he didn't find a lock or anything on it, so the quill key would be useless. He knew he would have to break the chain. Quick, get me a rock or something to smash the chain with, he told Hedger. That won't be necessary, said a voice from behind. Maximus turned back to see that one of the soldiers had finally caught up with them. He was standing at the entrance to the truck and he had a rifle pointed at them. Maximus realized that it was the same soldier he had taken out earlier. He stood there with the gun pointed towards them. Maximus and Hedger froze. The old man still just sat there in his corner mumbling about potassium or something. It looks like the end of the line for you two, the soldier said with a grin on his face. That's when a giant scorpion's tail shot out of the ground and ripped right through the soldier's chest. The Soldiers of Ares, Chapter 5. For a moment, Maximus was very confused. He even thought he might be dreaming. He had just seen a giant scorpion's tail shoot out from the ground and kill a soldier. It was safe to say he hadn't quite seen anything like that before. But it wasn't long before he understood what was going on. He looked to his side, and the look of sheer terror on Hedger's face confirmed what Maximus had already realized. The ground began to shake underneath them. Then the creature erupted from below, towering over the transport truck. The manticore had finally showed itself. It was easily bigger than a bus, and it stood there like an immense statue. It had 6 legs, all of which ended in paws with very large and sharp claws on all of them. It had really hard-looking armor on its back, legs, and tail, like the armor of a scorpion. It also had a huge scorpion's tail complete with a stinger and everything, and it was oozing a green poison which was burning the grass below as it fell. It also had yellowish-brown fur covering its entire body below the armor. But its most impressive feature by far was its head. It was a huge head of a fully grown male lion whose mane seemed to be as thick as its armor. And the manticore just stood there staring at the transport truck like it was a chew toy. Manticore, Hedger screamed. As a soldier, Maximus was trained not to falter in the face of danger, but it was really hard not to cry and run away screaming like a 3-year-old in the face of that thing. Maximus tried to draw his sword, but of course the only thing he had was the stupid cursed blade that wouldn't come out of its sheath. That's when the manticore slammed the truck aside with its tail. The truck landed on its side with Maximus, Hedger, and the old man still inside. Maximus had hit his head pretty hard in that fall, but luckily it wasn't bleeding. He looked outside to see the manticore staring at the soldiers, Rex, and the hooded man. Everyone had stopped fighting to look at the beast. No sudden movements. The hooded man said, "It's a predator, so it enjoys the chase." Then suddenly the manticore took one of the unconscious soldiers from the ground, snapped him in, two, and threw him to the side. Well, at least he died in his sleep, Maximus thought to himself miserably. The manticore now had blood dripping from its mouth, which just added to its scare factor. Then it let out a roar so loud that it shook the trees around them and could probably be heard for miles around. At this moment, one of the satyr soldiers decided to run, but before he could take 5 steps, the manticore slashed him with one of its claws and he was dead too. The captain slammed her spear on the ground and shouted, "We are soldiers of Ares, the god of war, and we do not run. So let's kill this abomination and bring its head as a prize for our king." Saying this, she readied her spear into battle position. The other soldiers also yelled in unison to show their support and came to her side. Soon a battle began between the manticore and the soldiers. Even the hooded man was helping the soldiers. "What the hell is going on?" Hedger said. His face looked like it was about to burst into tears. "Well, I would theorize that the manticore sensed the vibrations created due to the fighting done by the soldiers while it was still underground. Being a very territorial and predacious species, it most likely decided to confront and attack the unknown threat, which had encroached into its habitat," the old man said. Maximus and Hedger just stared at the old man with their mouths open. The guy who was blubbering nonsense just a few moments before had suddenly just spoken to them like a science professor. And just when Maximus had begun to think, the day couldn't get any weirder. "So you're not crazy then?" Maximus asked. "Not at the moment, no," the old man said. "But in another 14 minutes and 11 seconds I will return to being the blubbering fool you first encountered. But I do suggest that we get out of here well before then, my boy, unless you plan to die a rather horrific and painful death at the hands of a fully matured male ground manticore." Rex had just reached the truck as well. He put his head in and said, "I think that's enough scavenging for today, don't you?" The old man said, "Well, would you look at that, a minotaur with a broken horn. You should consider yourself lucky for being born in this era, my friend. A century ago that was considered as a sign of great shame among your people. Thank the gods that we have moved past such savage discriminations." The look of panic on Rex's face was replaced by one of utter confusion. "Who the heck is this?" he asked. "No idea," Maximus said. "He was a blubbering pile of mush a few seconds ago, but now he seems to be the human encyclopedia." The old man put up his finger and said, "Well, there's a very simple explanation for that." "Well, it will have to wait, Professor Crazy Pants, because right now we need to get out of here," Hedger said. The old man seemed to be a bit offended by this, but he decided to let it go. "I'm afraid I won't be going anywhere thanks to this," he said, holding up the chain around his leg. Rex looked at the chain, then at his 2 friends, and said, "Well, do we take him with us?" Maximus thought for a few seconds and then said, "We can't just leave him like this. Not with that thing out there." Rex nodded, then he took out his hammer and said, "All right, old man, stand back." Then he started hammering away on the chain. It took a few shots, but in the end it broke. "Much obliged," the old man said, "but I must warn you, within 3 minutes and 52 seconds, my mind will begin to wander again." Then the 4 of them stepped out, and the sight they saw was not comforting. Behind them, the battle between the manticore and the soldiers was still going on. The only problem was that the soldiers were losing badly. Even Captain Sharp was wounded and on the ground. "Come on, let's get out of here before." Rex didn't even have time to complete the sentence because the manticore had already turned its head towards them. The soldiers, seeing the gap, were retreating. Those that were still alive made a run for the remaining armored car. Lod the Minotaur managed to pick up Captain Sharp before heading for the car. But the manticore didn't care. After all, it had just got a new batch of chew toys. It looked at the group with hunger in its eyes. "Okay, Hedger, you and the old guy get out of here. Me and Maximus will try to slow that thing down," Rex said. "But," Hedger began to say, but Rex cut him off. "No buts, just listen and do as you're told," Rex said angrily. Maximus knew it was harsh, but it was the best decision. They would only be in the way. "Well, this is it, Max. We always did dream of fighting big monsters, didn't we?" Rex said. Maximus managed to pull off a smile to this and said, "Yep, everything is exactly as planned." Then he picked up a sword, which one of the soldiers had left behind, and charged at the manticore, and Rex was right there by his side, They tried to go for one of its legs, but within seconds he had gotten swatted aside by its tail. Maximus actually blanked out for a few seconds there. When the manticore had attacked him, it had hit his head pretty hard. But when he finally came to his senses, what he saw was worse. The manticore had cornered Rex. He was still holding off his attacks, but just barely. Unless Maximus did something, Rex was going to die. At that moment, Maximus felt something inside him. It wasn't fear or despair like he expected. It wasn't disappointment either. What he felt at that moment was nothing less than pure and unrelenting rage. Rage, that was the only word to describe it. Maximus had never felt so angry before in his life. He was so furious at the fact that he did not have the power needed to save his friend. At that moment, all he knew was that he would kill that manticore, even if it meant going down its throat and ripping it apart from the inside. Interesting, a voice said suddenly. Maximus didn't quite understand from where he heard the sound at first. Then again, it was like he hadn't heard it at all. More like the words had just appeared in his head. On further analysis, it seems you might be worthy of using my power after all, said the voice. Maximus felt a vibration on his back. As he looked over his shoulder, he noticed that it was coming from the sheathed blade. Who are you? Maximus asked. Someone who could lend you the power to save your friend. The question is, will you take it? Maximus didn't know what was going on, but without a moment's hesitation he answered, yes. Good, not a doubt in your mind, the voice said. There is a price, of course, but we will speak of the details later. For now, draw your blade. Without a second thought, Maximus tried to pull out the cursed blade, and the talisman on its sheath broke, and in his hands was a sword that was glowing red like his anger. The Soldiers of Ares, Chapter 6. Maximus had never held such a weapon like this in his life. The thing was humming slightly, and when he held it, he just knew that it could do some damage. With newfound confidence, he charged at the manticore. He aimed for one of the back legs, and as he slashed, he expected to cut off the entire leg. But sadly, things didn't exactly go according to plan. And even though the blade made a huge slash in the armor, it wasn't quite enough to slow it down. Never mind cutting the entire foot off. What it did manage to do was get the manticore's attention, and it turned to bare its bloody teeth at Maximus. Its roar alone pushed him back a few steps. Rex tried to help, but he was in no shape to even get up, much less try to take on a manticore. He managed to land his hammer onto one of its knees, but a casual swat with the manticore's tail sent him flying. Soon, he was on the ground, unconscious. Maximus was still able to dodge its shots. With its size, the claws were much slower than Maximus. The tail, on the other hand, moved like a whip. The only reason it hadn't turned Maximus into a human shish kebab was the fact that it was too large not to see coming. But he knew it would end soon. He could feel his body tiring. Also, the manticore had pushed him into a corner. Maximus couldn't run anymore, he just didn't have the energy. He was down on one knee, and he stared up to see the manticore's tail aimed right at him. He knew he couldn't dodge it this time. He knew this time it would kill him. Only a miracle could save him now, and the miracle came in the form of a blue slash. Just when the tail had been above the manticore's head, a blinding beam of blue light shot forward in the shape of a crescent. The tail was slashed right off, and the acid like poison started spilling everywhere, and most of it was landing on the manticore itself. Maximus ran for cover from the rain of poison that was spilling around him. The manticore started to roar again, only this time it was in pain. It began scrambling around, confused, trying to find what had brought it such pain. And then it found him, because walking towards the now tailless manticore was the hooded man, and in his hand was his sword, but this time it was significantly bluer. There was a blue energy surrounding the blade, but unlike Max's sword, which merely had energy around it, this one was enveloped in it. It was almost as if the entire blade was covered in an enormous blue flame. Only the hilt of the blade was spared. Maximus knew now from where the crescent-shaped blast had come. But now, what he really wanted to know was what kind of monster that man was. The man charged at the manticore, but even without its tail, the manticore was still a fearsome beast. It tried to slash the man with its front claw. The man, instead of dodging it, decided to block it, which would have been impossible with an ordinary sword. But the man not only blocked the claw, but he also thrust his blade further. Soon the claw lay beside him on the ground. Another roar of pain came from the monster. In its struggle, some of the acid spewing from its tail landed on the man's cloak, and it began to burn it away. The man then finally decided to throw away his cloak and hood, and Maximus saw that he was wearing black armor underneath it. Maximus couldn't help but feel that he had seen that armor before, but he couldn't quite place it, and he still hadn't gotten a good look at his face. It seemed impossible now because the cloak seemed to have been really slowing him down. However, now that he had got rid of it, he was moving like a blur, and the manticore was making sure that he didn't stand still for long. But the man easily dodged and blocked all of the monster's attacks. By now, the entire floor was filled with acid, but it didn't seem to have any effect on the armor, although it did manage to burn away the wraps around his legs. That was when Maximus saw it. The man's left leg was bionic. His left leg ended at the knee, and from there on, it was an artificial leg made of metal. That's when it hit Maximus, and suddenly he knew why the armor looked so familiar. The armor that did not cover the left leg. But that's impossible, Maximus thought to himself. He was supposed to be dead. The man had finally found an opening with the manticore. When the beast tried to take a bite out of him, the man ducked under its head and was now below the manticore's stomach. Maximus realized what he was doing. The underbelly of the manticore had no armor. It was its weak spot. Right then, the man thrust his sword upward into the beast's belly and with a final slash ripped a gaping hole in its stomach. Blood spewed from the wound, and the manticore was dead before its body hit the ground. For a moment, Maximus thought that the man was trapped under the corpse, but then he saw the man walking up to him, putting away his now normal-looking sword. He came right up to Maximus and said, "Just because you get a powerful weapon does not mean you know how to use it, kid." Maximus was trembling now worse than when he had seen the manticore. After all, Achilles had just called him kid. The Soldiers of Ares. Chapter 7. Your, Maximus tried to say. Achilles, the man, completed with a slight nod. Maximus couldn't believe his eyes. But standing before him was one of the greatest warriors in history, Achilles. The hero of the Trojan War, the invulnerable warrior, killer of Hector, a true legend among men. "But you're supposed to be dead," Maximus said. "So I have heard. Can you walk?" he answered. Maximus nodded and got to his feet. And now that he got a good look at him, there was no mistaking it. It really was the great Achilles. Maximus had seen pictures of him before, even an old video of a fight of his during the Trojan War. Heck, his bunkmate in the army had a poster of him hanging on their room wall. This was definitely him. His hair was black and had the same almost military-style cut as Maximus. He didn't have a beard, but he did have stubble growing. Guess he didn't have time to shave between plotting to take on a military convoy or something. It wasn't hard to see that he was good-looking. His features looked like they were sculpted, and his body seemed like it was carved from metal. Maximus remembered a female soldier named Cindy once telling him what a pity it was that someone so handsome had to die in war. Well, I guess Cindy was wrong, Maximus thought. He was definitely still alive. He even had the scar above his right eye, the one he had got in his legendary fight to the death with Hector, which Achilles won, of course. And the armor, Maximus couldn't believe that he hadn't recognized it at first. It was almost as famous as Achilles himself. The armor of Styx, a legendary armor forged by the smith god Hephaestus, made from a rare black metal only found at the bottom of the powerful river called Styx that flowed in the underworld. It was said to invulnerable to almost any form of attack. Maximus was looking at a piece of history itself. Achilles walked up him and asked, "Are you all right?" To which Maximus nodded. "I apologize for breaking away from battle for a while, but I needed time to charge my attack," Achilles continued, "and in my tired state it took longer than expected." Maximus wanted to respond, but he was still a bit too awestruck to form eligible words, so he just nodded again. Achilles then walked over to Rex, who was still unconscious. "You might want to find a way to wake him up," Achilles said. "I don't think carrying him is an option. Then get out of here as fast as you can. The soldiers will be back with reinforcements." The transport was carrying a high-profile target. Maximus realized he was talking about the old man. He still didn't understand how he fitted into the picture or why he was a high-profile target. "So what are you planning to do?" Maximus asked, finally able to pull himself together. "I have to find him before the soldiers do." Maximus thought about this for a moment, and he came to the conclusion that he might be safer with Achilles than the soldiers. Then he said, Sir, Mr. Achilles, I think we can move together. The old man you're searching for is most probably with my friend the sprite." Achilles looked at Maximus. His expressions were still as stone-faced as ever. "Do you have any idea where they might be?" Even though they hadn't planned it, Maximus had a pretty good idea where Hector would be headed. "There's a cave not far from here. Its entrance is hard to find unless you know it's there, so it's safe for most animals and monsters. We sort of use it as our camp between long scavenger hunts." Achilles nodded at this and said, "And your name?" holding out his arm. Maximus realized that he still hadn't introduced himself. He shook his hand. "Maximus, sir. And that's Rex, by the way," he said, pointing to his still unconscious friend. Well, despite everything that happened to him, at least he could say he shook hands with Achilles. It took a while to get Rex back on his feet again, but some water from a nearby stream finally woke him up. When he got up, his first words were, "Are we dead?" Maximus responded with a grin and said no, but the manticore sure is. "How?" he managed to mutter, and Maximus just pointed at Achilles. "Who's that?" Rex asked. "Remember the hooded guy?" Maximus said, and Rex nodded. Maximus was about to say more, but Achilles cut him off. "If he can walk, then we should get moving." Maximus nodded and began leading the way with Rex closely at his shoulder. Achilles followed a few feet behind. After half an hour or so, Rex had finally regained whatever strength he could, and his head was feeling better too. When he was sure Achilles wasn't near enough to hear, he murmured to Maximus, "You know, now that I get a good look at him, he kind of looks like—" "He is," Maximus said. Rex let out a snort and said, "No, listen, the guy I'm thinking of is dead." "Well, he's not," Maximus replied. "That's him all right, with the scar and armor and everything." Rex turned back to look at the man again, this time more wide-eyed than before. "What makes you so sure?" Maximus merely shrugged his shoulders and said, "'Cause he told me." Maximus wasn't sure if Achilles had heard them or not, but even if he did, it didn't show it. After that, Rex fell silent. Maximus guessed that the new piece of information must have made his head hurt again. After all, he still couldn't believe it himself. After a few more minutes, they reached the entrance of the cave. And when they went inside, Hedger was waiting for them with the old man, just like Maximus had predicted. "You're alive," Hedger said with joy. "How the heck are you still alive?" Hedger started flying in circles around his friends. "Thank him," Maximus said towards Achilles. Hedger looked at the great warrior and said, "I don't get it. You guys got rescued by a male supermodel?" Of course, Hedger was never in the army, so he wasn't exactly familiar with what Achilles looked like, but Maximus was sure even he had heard of his name. "Hedger, that's Achilles," he said. It took a few seconds for Hedger to let what he had heard sink in. "Achilles," he said, "as in the Trojan War hero, Achilles." Maximus nodded, and he had never seen Hedger's mouth so wide open before. This was saying something, as he rarely shut his mouth. Maximus looked around the cave and saw that the old man was sitting in a corner mumbling to himself again. "What happened?" Maximus asked. "Yeah, he sort of went back to his factory settings after we got separated," Hedger said. "But he did say that he would speak sensibly again in another 11 hours and 45 minutes or something, right before he went cuckoo and started talking about tea cultivation methods." Achilles walked up to the old man. After seeing for himself what had happened, he turned to the other three for explanation. Maximus and Hedger explained the best they could about how they had found the old man and how he had turned normal for some time. At the end of their story, Achilles said, "You sprite, he said he would be normal again in 11 hours?" Hedger nodded and said, "In 45 minutes. But that's all we know, Mr. Achilles, honest. We have no idea what's wrong with your grandpa." "My grandfather?" Achilles said, clearly not understanding that he meant it as a joke. Maximus was kind of glad he didn't. Hedger had an annoying habit of making jokes when he got nervous. And Maximus really didn't think this was the time. "I assure you that we are not related by blood, but I do owe a great deal to this man," Achilles said. "You might have heard of him. His name is Daedalus." All three of them had definitely heard the name before. Daedalus was considered to be one of the greatest inventors alive, and was known for having nearly 1,000 patents in his name. They said that his wisdom ranged into every topic imaginable, from physical mechanics to cellular biology to sports statistics. It was said that if you had used a piece of technology in your life, it probably had something Daedalus invented in it. "So that old man is Daedalus, the great inventor," Rex said, and Achilles nodded. "Great, and I called him Professor Crazy Pants," Hedger muttered. Achilles then sat on a rock and said, "It seems I will have to wait a few hours for some answers then, and I must thank you three for your help, even if at times it was unintentional." He was right about that. They had gone back to find him in order to stop him from attacking the convoy, and somewhere along the way they had all ended up in the same team. But now Maximus and the others were faced with a big question: what to do next? Maximus knew that their troubles weren't over just yet. They had attacked and helped rob a military convoy. One that had been carrying a high-level prisoner such as Daedalus just made it worse. It wasn't hard to figure out why Daedalus was taken prisoner. Mars has been at war with the country of Minerva for over 5 years now. Both Maximus and Rex had even fought against their soldiers, and Rex had even been on the front line. The land of Minerva was ruled by Empress Athena, the goddess of wisdom. Their capital city of Athens was also named after her. Even though her official title said Goddess of Wisdom, her strategic brilliance and powerful army had earned her another name as well, the Goddess of War. This name greatly annoyed Lord Ares. But the war between the two countries was contained at the front lines for now, so the trenches were not really affected. Also, the trenches were not exactly a place brimming with patriotism, as most of the people were outcasts there. Anyway, Daedalus was a resident of Athens, fitting as it was considered as the innovative capital of the world. He was also a known advisor to the empress there. It didn't take a genius to figure out the amount of intel he could provide. But all this meant that the three of them were wanted fugitives by now. So what's the plan? Hedger finally asked. Rex thought about this for a while, then he said, I think we should spend the night in the caves. For one thing, I'm in no shape to start crawling through the tunnels again. For another, by tomorrow we can be sure if the soldiers are searching for us. Maximus agreed. He knew that by now the soldiers who escaped would have reported back and that the army would start searching for whoever attacked them. And, as always, the search would start at the trenches. A soldier, a minotaur without an arm, and a green sprite was not exactly a very common team-up, and they would be identified instantly. They had to be real careful while entering the city tomorrow. So it's agreed, then we'll spend the night here, Rex said. Hedger began flying around trying to find a good place to hang his tail. If you want us to leave, I would understand, Achilles said. Not at all, sir. There are enough rocks here for all of us, Hedger said, and Maximus and Rex nodded in agreement. There's no need to call me sir. Achilles is fine, he said, and there was even a very slight smile on his face. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I'm starving, Hedger said. We still got the apricots from the morning. Most got real squashed in the fight, but they are still edible, Rex said. And so they all enjoyed a dinner of squashed apricots and water from a nearby stream. Even Daedalus ate some between his mumbling. With this, it was time to turn in for the night. Achilles decided to take the first watch, which everyone was fine with. If he had wanted to kill them, he had plenty of other ways than in their sleep. And after the way he had saved them multiple times today, even after they tried to stop him, it was hard not to trust the guy. Maximus finally lay down on the most comfortable rock he could find, and in a few seconds he was sound asleep. The Soldiers of Ares. Chapter 8. Maximus opened his eyes, and all around him all he could see was darkness. I think it's time we spoke, child, a voice said, and he knew it was the same voice that had spoken to him before, the one that had unsheathed his blade. Where am I? Maximus asked. Why, we are inside your head. Not to worry, your body is still asleep. Just think of this as a dream. Maximus wasn't sure what was going on, but that had been happening a lot lately, so he decided to just go with it. All right then, who are you? Maximus asked. I'm afraid I cannot tell you that. My identity remaining unknown is very important to my safety at the moment. But to you, I am a friend. Great, Maximus thought. A voice in my head wants to be my friend. He was pretty sure this was one of the first signs of insanity. So, friend, this blade is yours? Maximus asked. In a way, yes, but you can have it. You just have to do a favor for me, the voice said. And that would be? He asked. Nothing too complicated, of course. As you notice, this is an energy weapon. To be more specific, it is a heat blade. The way it works is that it generates heat around the blade that greatly increases its attack power. The heat increases depending on your strength and willpower, and sometimes it is also influenced by emotion, the voice said. Maximus thought about this and said, like when I got angry while fighting the manticore? Exactly, the voice said. Now you are free to use it as you please as long as you follow one condition. When you come across a powerful enough energy source, allow the blade to absorb it. Maximus was quite sure that he needed professional psychiatric help now. He wasn't even able to understand the voice in his own head. I'm not sure I follow, he said. It's simple. You just keep fighting monsters and anything else you feel like. Everything has energy inside it, and the blade will automatically absorb it. You need not do anything extra. But if I were to detect a powerful enough force, I need you to go and absorb it. And how do I do that? Maximus asked. Simply make it come in contact with the blade, and you need not worry about locating them either. I will let you know if I sense them. So Maximus, do you agree? Maximus didn't like any of this business deal, but he knew that the blade was really powerful, and he probably wouldn't get another one like it in his lifetime. He decided that the best course of action would be not to overthink it. All right then, it's a deal, he said. The voice sounded pleased by this. Excellent. Now it is important that you do not tell anyone that you have spoken with me. Otherwise, I will make sure that the sword returns to being a useless piece of junk. Most would not believe you anyway. And to show my appreciation in our newfound friendship, I shall give you this parting gift. The darkness began to fade away, and soon Maximus was standing in a huge room. The walls and pillars were red and gold, and there were 2 Minotaur soldiers standing guard at the entrance. The walls were decorated with every kind of weapon imaginable, including swords, shields, guns, and even a couple of RPGs. At the center of the room was a huge throne made of gold and encrusted with rubies. Its seats and cushions were made from red silk, and the top of the throne was decorated with a golden spearhead with a single huge triangular ruby at the center. The red and gold spear was the symbol of Lord Ares. Behind the throne was a huge portrait of Ares standing in a battlefield with his spear raised in one hand and the beheaded head of a cyclops in the other. Maximus realized that he was standing in Ares's throne room. A chill ran down his spine. This really was one of the last places he wanted to be right now. "Do not worry, child, no one can see you here," the voice said. "Neither can you interact with anything that happens. All you can do is watch and observe." Just then the doors to the throne room opened, and 3 men entered, and the one in the middle was none other than Lord Ares himself. Maximus had seen Lord Ares before, but only while giving speeches through a monitor. But seeing him in person was not the same. He stood at about 8 feet tall, easily dwarfing the 2 Minotaur guards at the door, and his body was as muscular as it was large, with arms the size of tree trunks. He was wearing a red uniform, with a matching general's cap with his spear symbol in the center. His uniform was decorated with many medals and even buttons made of gold. His hair was short, and he had a full-grown but neatly trimmed beard, and both were a fiery red. He walked in and sat on his throne, and it was easy to see from the expression on his face that he was not happy. The other 2 men were not exactly ordinary citizens either. They were the 2 second-in-command officers in the army, and were only outranked by Lord Ares himself. Maximus recognized the 2 generals. They were Deimos, the god of fear, and Phobos, the god of terror. Both men were also dressed in the army's red. Deimos looked young, like he was in his late 20s, but Maximus knew he was much older. He was the strongest mage in the army, and was dressed in robes with a hood like most army mages. He also carried a long staff with him. Phobos, on the other hand, was a pure warrior. He was almost as big as Ares and had long black hair till his shoulder, but no beard. He was dressed in full battle armor and had a huge skull of some monster for the shoulder guard. He had no weapon on him now, but Maximus had heard that he used a giant club and a machine gun in battle. Last he had heard both these generals were at the front line in their war against Athena. If they were called back, it must be for something important. "Sir, the report says that the convoy was attacked by a group of 4, but that the prisoner escaped when the soldiers were assaulted by a manticore while engaging in battle with the attackers," Deimos said. Ares looked at his generals with rage. "I do not want a report. I want Daedalus back in chains." "Do we know who did this?" Phobos asked. His voice was like rocks grinding each other. "Well, it does not take a genius to figure out it was one of Athena's men," Ares said. "Yes, my lord, but all of her most powerful soldiers are still on the front line, including her champion. We already checked," Deimos said. "So," Ares said. It was easy to see that he was annoyed. "Well, my lord, of the attackers a swordsman, he was said to be quite powerful. He almost took out the entire convoy single-handedly. It is also likely that it was he who took out the manticore. He is definitely no ordinary fighter. What difference does it make if Athena begged for outside help? I do not plan to send a weakling to hunt down someone who dares steals from me," Ares said. Just then a woman entered the room and said, "Brother, the soldiers you asked for have arrived." Maximus knew this woman as well. She was the 3rd and final of Ares's generals, Eris. She was also his sister. Eris was called the Goddess of Discord, a name she had earned due to her deceptive methods in battle, which she used to turn allies against each other. Maximus didn't know the details. This was just something that he had heard while he was in the army. She had red hair like her brother, and she let it grow long. Also, she would have been beautiful if her face wasn't stuck with a permanent scowl. She was in full red battle armor that had enough jewels on it to buy a 4-storied mansion. Maximus couldn't believe that he was actually witnessing a meeting between all the top officers of the army. "Send them in," Ares told his sister. On her command, 4 soldiers entered. It was none other than Captain Deborah Sharp and her team, the ones that had survived anyway. Only 2 humans and the Minotaur Laud were left with her. "Captain Sharp, is it? Can you explain to me why my prisoner did not reach me?" Lord Ares asked almost mockingly. "I have no excuses, my lord," Captain Sharp said with her head bowed. "Good, because I really wasn't in the mood to hear any. But you see, whatever the reason, I am not someone who takes failure lightly. Please, my lord, the swordsman that attacked us was no ordinary man," Laud said, and then the manticore. But Lord Ares had just got off his throne, and that was enough to stop Laud in mid-sentence. Ares then walked up to the Minotaur and grabbed his neck. Then he lifted him with the ease of lifting a baby. Laud's feet were not even touching the ground. "Perhaps you are trying to tell me that it was my fault for not providing adequate security." He was choking Laud, and he could barely speak. No, my lord," Laud had begun to say, but it was too late. Ares, with a squeeze of his arm, snapped the Minotaur's neck. Laud lay dead on the ground the next second. "Well, Captain, I expect you to return with my prisoner or not to return at all. Now go," Ares said angrily. The captain and her subordinates left with a bow, not saying another word. "And someone get this carcass out of my sight," he continued. The guards at the door came and took away Laud's body. They seemed to be used to doing this. "Are you sure we should not let someone more capable bring back Daedalus, my lord? Perhaps one of us?" Deimos said, "Yes, I am aware of that, but not any of you, Deimos. I want you and Phobos to return to the front line immediately. Eris, go join them within a few days with whatever supplies are needed for the war." The three generals nodded in agreement to this. Ares continued, "And dear sister, give the task of finding Daedalus to our champion." Eris didn't seem too sure of this. "Are you sure of this, brother, to trust such an important task with the barbarian?" "Yes, I believe he is more than capable," Ares said. "Just make sure to tell him that I want Daedalus alive and not to feed him to those wicked horses of his." Then suddenly the scene began to dissolve and Maximus awoke with a start. The Soldiers of Ares. Chapter 9. When Maximus woke, it was still night, and everyone else was sleeping. He thought of the dream he just had. No way was it just a regular dream. It was too real and intact, and unlike most dreams, he remembered all of it. Well, Lord Ares was definitely not happy about losing Daedalus, and it seemed they had also been added to the list of the people who freed him. Maximus was starting to realize that it might be impossible to return to the trenches, or stay anywhere in the trenches for that matter. They could try talking to the army, but he had a feeling that the end result might be similar to Laud's fate. They could try returning Daedalus, but he didn't fancy their chances against Achilles. Besides, it felt wrong. Advisor to Athena or not, a brilliant scientist like Daedalus did not belong in the dungeons of Ares. Maximus realized that the best option they had was to run. He had dreamt of leaving the trenches for a long time, but now that he was being forced to do so, he wasn't so sure anymore. After all, this was his home. Besides, even if they did run, where would they go? But if Ares' champion was after them, they really couldn't linger around. A champion was a post given to only one warrior in any kingdom. He or she was like a personal fighter for a god. They usually outranked most military officers as well, and only took orders from their patron gods. Needless to say, the champions were very powerful and feared warriors, and Ares' champion was a merciless killer. Another question arose in Max's mind. How was he going to explain everything he had just seen, especially since the voice in the sword had specifically instructed him not to reveal its existence? That's when Maximus heard a noise from outside. He went out to look and saw a figure walking around the bushes nearby. At first he thought it might be a soldier, but he knew that the army would never send just one person to do a search. He thought about his next move and he decided to confront the person, but not without backup. His first choice would have been Rex, but he was still wounded from before, and he really did not want to wake Achilles. So he went with Hedger. That way he thought if things went bad, Hedger could fly back up and wake up the others. He slowly went to his friend who was hanging upside down with his tail wrapped around a stalactite fast asleep and shook him to wake him up. "Yes, I'll have another orange pastry," Hedger mumbled in his sleep. It took a couple more shakes to finally wake him up. He finally awoke and said, "What happened now? Did some other famous celebrity walk into our cave?" "Stop kidding around, Hedge. There's someone in the bushes nearby, and we need to check it out." This woke him up. "You have a Minotaur soldier and one of the greatest warriors in history right there, and you call me for backup?" He said angrily. "Rex is still injured, and if you want to wake up Achilles with no good reason, be my guest," Maximus said. "But there might be a good reason. They could be soldiers," Hedger replied. Maximus shook his head in response. "I don't think so. For one thing, there's only one guy, and he's moving around like he's a bit lost." Hedger thought for a moment. "All right, but you do the talking. At the first sight of trouble, I'll fly back up and call in the cavalry." Maximus nodded, and then both of them went down into the bushes. They moved through the bushes as stealthy as they could and found their guy standing in a clearing taking a rest from his search. "You know, with our luck, I wouldn't be surprised if this was the great Heracles. I heard he goes by the name Hercules now, ever since he had a fight with Queen Hera," Maximus said. "Anyway, let's focus on the work at hand and discuss world gossip at another time." Hedger nodded and said, "Okay, you go on ahead and I'll wait here. If things get ugly, I'll bolt back to the cave and call the others." Maximus agreed, and he stepped out into the clearing. Maximus still couldn't see the person properly since it was still really dark. "Stop whatever you were doing and turn around slowly, and don't try anything funny, I'm already armed." He said this with the most confident voice he could muster. He had his hand on his sword, ready to draw at the first sight of trouble. The person turned. He looked at Maximus, or in this case she did, because the person was none other than Kayla. Kayla ran up to Maximus and hugged him. Maximus felt his knee shiver. He also felt as though his stomach was doing a somersault. Kayla had never hugged him before, and Maximus had sort of dreamed of this moment in his head 1,000,000 times. But now that it was here, he was nervous and sweating. Kayla, what are you doing here? He asked. Searching for you, everyone thinks you're dead. Rumors said that you guys were involved in the fight against the Manticore, and I feared the worst. Wait, where are Hedger and Rex? At that moment, Hedger came flying out and said, Right here, my lady, with a grin on his face. Rex is fine too. He did get injured in the battle, so he's resting in the cave. Maximus said, glad, and a bit disappointed that Kayla had let go of him. Kayla seemed relieved to hear that they were all okay. I knew you guys would be at the stupid cave you always talked about. I knew it was somewhere around here, but I couldn't find the entrance. Yeah, it's a bit hard to spot if you don't know where it is. But you shouldn't be here, especially at night. The outskirts are dangerous. Kayla gave him a look and said, Oh, please, don't be such a guy, like I'm a helpless little lamb or something. You know that I'm just as well trained as you. Maximus knew this was true. He knew that her father gave her regular combat training almost every day. Being the daughter of a paranoid ex-soldier was like that, he guessed. Also, there was a kind of toughness you got from growing up in the trenches, and Kayla had plenty of it. Besides, Kayla continued, I bought one of my dad's toys along just in case. She pulled out a submachine gun from under her top and Uzi and showed it to them. Remind me never to get on your bad side, girl, Hedger said, and Kayla smiled at this. The smile lit a small flame in Max's heart, one that warmed him from the inside. Soon there was a grin on his face. I wouldn't be grinning like an idiot if I were you. Just look at this, Kayla said. She then handed him a piece of paper. He opened it to see that it was a wanted poster, one made for him, Rex and Hedger. It was a standard military wanted poster. Maximus had seen many of them like this before, but he had never expected to see his face on one of them. It said, Wanted alive, followed by 3 boxes. 2 contained his and Rex's photos, the ones that were used in their files in the army. The third contained a drawing of a weird green bird thing. Maximus realized that it was supposed to be Hedger, but it looked nothing like him. Below these were their names and details of a reward to anyone who could help find them. Also details on how to contact the army were given at the bottom. It had the official seal of the army on it, the crimson and gold spear. Is that supposed to be me? Hedger asked, staring at the poster. Has no one in the army even seen a sprite before in their lives? Maximus agreed. He felt that it was high time the army got a new sketch artist. I wonder how much the rewards on our heads are, though, Maximus said. Kayla gave both of them a slight whack on the head. Then she said, You guys are taking this way too lightly. Do you realize what this means? There's no way you can return to the trenches now. Maximus had already feared this. He said, Yeah, I know. The 3 of them stood silently for a while. Finally, Hedger spoke. Maybe we can sneak in and get our stuff at least. Kayla shook her head. That's not possible. The soldiers already trashed your home searching for you guys. I'm pretty sure they still have someone watching them. Hedger stared at the ground and said, So this is it then. We have to say goodbye to the trenches and everyone we know, just like that. No one answered him. After a few seconds of silence, Kayla finally asked, How did you guys get into so much trouble anyway? Maximus was about to answer when she said, No, on second thought, don't tell me. The less I know, the better. They already know you guys hung out at the cannon, and the army mages have ways of getting information out of people. I think it will be better if I know nothing. Maximus didn't like this, but he knew that it was the smart thing to do. Well, I guess this is it then. I guess you guys got to get out of here and lay low for a while. You can probably come back after things cool down a bit, Kayla said in a low voice. Don't worry, I promise that we will come back, Maximus said, trying to give her an assuring smile. Then Kayla did something unexpected. She stepped forward and grabbed Max's shirt. Then she kissed him on the lips. When she finally pulled away, she said, Just in case you ever feel like breaking that promise, and gave him a slight smile. Maximus just stood there dumbstruck at what had happened. He couldn't even utter a single word. I have to get back before Dad wakes up and say goodbye to Rex for me too, Hedger. Then with a smile, she gave a final wave as she turned and left. The Soldiers of Ares. Chapter 10. It took a few seconds after she left for Maximus to return to his senses. When he looked at Hedger, he had a grin so wide on his face that his lips were almost touching his ears. Not one word, Maximus said before Hedger could say anything. The sun had risen by the time they got back to the cave, and Hedger had been snickering the whole way. They had stopped to gather water from the stream on the way, and by the time they got back, Rex and Achilles were already awake. Only Daedalus was still asleep, curled up in a corner. Where did you guys go? Rex asked. Kayla was here searching for us. We just went to talk to her, Maximus said. And? Rex asked. Before Maximus could say anything, Hedger said, And they did more than just talk, if you know what I mean. Our young Max is all grown up now, kissing girls in the middle of the night. Maximus scowled. but a smile lit up Rex's face. He patted Maximus on the back and said, "Well done, Max. You sure did take your sweet time, but you finally manned up and did it. But you don't seem too happy about it. She didn't slap you, did she?" Maximus shook his head and said, "No, nothing like that, and actually she kissed me." "Well, so much for you manning up," Rex said with a snort, "but you two finally kissed and the result is what's important. So, why do you still look so gloomy?" Maximus took out the wanted poster, handed it to Rex, and said, "This is why." The smile vanished from Rex's face and his head came back to reality. "Never thought we'd end up on one of these," he said. Maximus told him everything Kayla had said. "So in short, we got every soldier, snitch and bounty hunter in the trenches on the lookout for us. There's no way we can go back." Rex nodded, but all this left them with one question: where to next? All three of them had spent their entire life in Mars, and as far as Maximus knew, neither of them knew anyone outside the country. "Maybe we don't need to leave. I still got some friends in the army. If we can get to them, we can talk our way out of this mess," Rex said. Maximus knew that it was no use. He shook his head and said, "Unless your contacts just happen to be one of the three generals or Lord Ares himself, I don't think it's much use." All of them, including Achilles, looked at him. Achilles asked, "Why do you say that?" Maximus realized he still hadn't told them about his dream. He wasn't sure how to start either. Well, yesterday, I saw a dream, and it sort of involved all the top ranks in the army," he said. Maximus went on to explain everything he had seen, but he left out the part about the voice. He just told whatever he saw in the throne room. After listening to his story, everyone fell silent. Finally, Achilles asked, "Do you have the gift of prophecy?" Maximus shook his head and said, "No, at least I don't think so. Maybe it was just a regular dream, that's all," Hedger said. But Rex didn't seem to think so. "It sure doesn't sound like it. The details are too real." Maximus realized that he had to give some sort of explanation, but he really didn't want to lie to his friends either. He decided that the best option was to tell a part of the truth at least. "Guys, I think it has something to do with this," he said, showing them his sword. What does any of this have to do with that?" Edger asked. "And what happened to the talisman that was on it?" Rex asked. The two of them still didn't know that he could draw the sword now, so he took it out and showed it to them. The sword looked magnificent, but it did not have the red glow around it. This time, Rex took the sword from his hand to examine it and asked, "When did this happen?" "When we were fighting the Manticore, you were unconscious by then," he answered. "I sort of just pulled it in mid-battle, and the talisman broke. The next thing I know, the sword was in my hand." When Hedger too had finished looking at the sword, he gave it back to Maximus and said, "As weird as that is, I still don't get how a sword gave you psychic powers. I mean, a sword that gives you vision just seems far-fetched to me." "Far-fetched perhaps, but not impossible," said Daedalus from behind them. He had finally woken up, and it seemed he was actually in his senses again. 11 hours and 45 minutes. The timing works perfectly," Daedalus said. It was the first time since they met that Maximus actually saw Achilles smile. "Daedalus, my old friend, it's nice to see you have returned," he said. They shared a brief hug and shook each other's hands. "Oh, I wish I was in a better state to greet you, Achilles. Nonetheless, I wish I had some way to thank you for the rescue," Daedalus said. "Well, you could start by explaining why you seemed a bit off for the last 11 hours, he said. "And 45 minutes, Daedalus added with a smile. There was a spark in his eyes now, and that was no accident either, my friend. It is the effect of my latest invention, a potion really, and I haven't thought of a name for it yet. What this potion does is it makes the neurotoxins within your brain go haywire, thus making the drinker for all purposes insane. But that's not the clever part. I designed it in such a way so that every 12 hours the drinker returns to their sane self for 15 minutes. Maximus sort of understood what he was talking about, but he had to ask, "But why would you drink it yourself, sir?" He felt like a school child asking the teacher a question in a lesson. "For security, my boy," Daedalus began to explain. "When I got caught by Ares's men while researching the rare Halluclove flower in the forest, I quickly drank the potion so as to prevent them from extracting information from me. You see, this way I couldn't tell them anything no matter what they tried, even torture. And even in the 15 minutes I came to my senses, I could still pretend to be mad while still in captive. Also, even in my state of madness, I am still aware of everything around me. I merely cannot act on it since my body and mind are not connected at the time." Maximus thought about what he just heard. It seemed a bit insane, but it was effective. It would have been really hard for the army to get information on Athena's plans when their prisoner was a mumbling vegetable. "But now aren't you sort of stuck like this?" Hedger asked. "Not at all. I have an antidote created for it already. But sadly, it is still in my lab in Athens. and trying to recreate it would not be advised as I do not have the equipment or the ingredients for it." Achilles looked at the old inventor with a smirk and said, "Only you would think of something so crazy and brilliant at the same time." Daedalus gave a little bow and said, "I humbly accept your praise, old friend. Now that you are all fully aware of my situation, I think it would be wise for us to listen to the young Max's vision," Daedalus said. "So you think his visions are real?" Achilles asked. Daedalus nodded in agreement. "I most certainly do. Even if he is not a prophet, there are still many ways he could see the visions. For one, someone else could be giving it to him. But I think he is onto something about his sword." "So you think the sword is giving him the vision?" Hedger asked, still a bit unconvinced. "Well, I'm not sure, but I did notice that the markings and designs of his blade are quite ancient. Perhaps even from a time when technology was not so advanced." Maximus wasn't sure where he was going with this, but he still nodded in agreement. So did everyone else. But Daedalus sighed. The blank expressions on all their faces were a dead giveaway. "I believe a quick history lesson is needed here," Daedalus said. "Back in the old days during the Titan rule, and such technology was still non-existent. Still, the Titans ran an empire nearly as well established as the gods. The reason for this is that magic was much more advanced in those days. But once the gods took over, the world was built up from scratch again, and a lot of things, including advanced magic techniques and spells, were lost to us in the Titan War. But when the Olympian Empire began to grow magic, and technology began to grow hand in hand, even though this was a great achievement indeed, it had one drawback. Since magic and technology could make up for and what the other lacked, it prevented both sectors from advancing beyond a certain point. In theory, technology would have advanced much further if there was no magic. Similarly, our magic today is not nearly as advanced as it was during the Titan Age." He stopped to see if everyone had understood. "So, you are trying to say Max's blade is from that era?" Rex asked. "Exactly, and if that is the case, it is quite possible that his blade could have enchantments on it, which we have never heard of." Daedalus concluded with that, and looked at them. "So it's agreed then. We take the kid's dreams very seriously," Achilles said. "All that's great, but that still leaves us with nowhere to go," Hedger pointed out. "Perhaps I can be of assistance there as well. After all, you are in all this trouble because you helped aid my rescue." Rex asked, "What do you have in mind?" Daedalus took a sip of water from the bottle they had filled and said, "Well, as you know, I am an advisor to Empress Athena. If you were to join me to Athens, I am sure she would reward you handsomely for your deed. You could even live in Athens if you like." Maximus shifted uncomfortably at this, and his eyes met Rex's. He knew they were thinking the same thing. Mars and Minerva had been at war for years now. Somehow Maximus didn't think 2 ex-soldiers from Mars and their friend would be very welcome at Athens asking for a citizenship. "I don't think that would be a great idea, Daedalus. They used to be Ares' soldiers once, after all," Achilles said. It seemed he too was having the same train of thought. "Oh well, I did not think of that, but I do hope you will join me till there, and I personally guarantee all your safety in Athens." Maximus looked at Hedger and Rex, and after a few seconds all three of them nodded in agreement. After all, they had nowhere else to go. "Excellent," Daedalus said happily. "And who knows, you might even change your mind about living there once you see the city." He then suddenly looked up, somewhat distracted. "I'm afraid I only have 28 seconds left before I return to my mumbling self. And Achilles, please do get me a watch just to time my episodes more accurately." Sure enough, after a few more seconds, Daedalus began muttering rubbish with a blank expression again. After that, they decided to leave as quickly as possible. Rex knew a few ways out of Mars, but the problem was that they led into the country of Vulcan. Vulcan was one of the neighboring countries to Mars. It was ruled by the god of machines, Hephaestus. He was said to be one of the best blacksmiths in the world, and his mechanical skills were legendary. Because of this, he was also known as the god of the forge, or the smith god. The Vulcan kingdom was much smaller than Mars, and it had only one major city in it, which acted as its capital. Since it was the only city in the country, it was just called Vulcan City. Other than that, only a few minor settlements and villages were present. Vulcan City was situated right beside one of the world's largest volcanoes called Mount Etna. Achilles said that they would head there first as he had a friend who could help them. The problem was that the path to the city was across a huge desert, and they would need transportation to pass it. Our best option would be to try and salvage the truck, or the armored car the army left behind in the fight against the Manticore. Also, we are going to need some food and resources for our journey since we won't find anything in the desert, Achilles said. It was decided that 2 of them would go and scout if the vehicles were still there and gather some resources while the other 2 would stand guard over Daedalus. Maximus offered to go with Achilles outside, but Rex said he was feeling much better and that he needed to stretch his legs. So Maximus and Hedger stayed back with Daedalus, while the other two went out to find whatever they needed. Maximus began practicing with his new blade. He was hoping to bring back the red glow from before, but it had no use. Hedger had just stepped out to see if there was anything edible nearby. When he came back, Maximus asked, "How was the hunt?" "Nothing great, just a few cherries, and they are not that sweet either." Hedger said it was easy to see he was in a bad mood, and Maximus couldn't really blame him. "Hey, I know this is not the way we planned it, but we always said that we would leave the trenches one day. It just came a bit earlier than expected." That hadn't exactly cheered him up. "Yeah, but did we ever have the army chasing us out as part of the plan?" Maximus had no answer to that. He realized that nothing he said would cheer Hedger up, so he left him alone. About half an hour or so later, Rex and Achilles returned. Rex had a couple of dead rabbits in his hand. "A good hunt. We got us enough supplies to last us a couple of days at least," Rex said. He dropped the rabbits into Hedger's lap. Hedger looked at the dead animals sadly and said, "How could you kill something so cute?" "By listening to my grumbling stomach instead of you," Rex replied. Rex and Achilles opened their bags to show some wild fruits and vegetables, a few eggs, some mushrooms, and even a few fish. Maximus had no idea how they managed to catch fish without a rod or a net, but he figured Achilles had something to do with it. Guess he would have made a fine scavenger if he hadn't turned into one of the greatest heroes in the Trojan War. "We scouted the vehicles. The good news is, the army already came there and left, and they seem to have taken the Manticore's body with them, but they left their trucks behind," Achilles said. Maximus and Hedger nodded for him to continue. "The bad news, on the other hand, is that the armored car is too damaged to use, and we can only know if the truck still works if we can get it upright again." "Well, I guess we start moving then. They might still have someone move the trucks if we wait around for too long," Maximus said. The group gathered everything they had and started moving towards yesterday's battlefield. They started walking back carefully, just in case any soldiers were still patrolling the area. They were mostly silent. Only Daedalus kept mumbling nonsense as he walked, and he often had to be nudged in the right direction to stay with the group. After a while, Achilles asked, "You said that other than the captain we fought before, Ares also sent his champion after us, correct?" Maximus nodded in agreement. Achilles then asked, "Who is it?" Rex let out a slight grunt of disgust. This was not uncommon among the soldiers of Mars. The champion was not very popular among them. "You might have heard of him," Rex said. "He is known as the barbarian king, Diomedes." "I have actually, but I must say not ever anything good," Achilles said. Rex grunted in agreement. "Not surprising. That man is no soldier. He is nothing more than a vile murderer. With too much power, he is brutal without reason, and not just to the enemies either. He has the blood of many of his own soldiers on his hands." They were close to the trail now. Maximus could see the cliff from where they had fallen. "He seems like the perfect champion for a tyrant like Ares," Achilles said. Maximus was quite sure by now Achilles really despised Lord Ares, and that was not surprising. Most people outside of Mars did, many inside as well, but he was starting to feel that the hatred was more personal. "Have you met Ares before?" Maximus asked. Achilles nodded. "Yes, a long time ago during the Trojan War, and I would have named him the god of cowards rather than that of war. The only thing he knows to protect is his own putrid hide." Maximus knew that Ares had been on the side of the Trojans during the war, even though he first came to support the Greeks. During the war, he betrayed them and decided to join with the Trojans. Maximus could easily understand why anyone in the Greek side would hate Ares. They had finally reached the clearing where the battle had taken place, and just like they said, the Manticore's body was nowhere to be seen. The truck they were hoping to salvage was still there, though. The only problem was that it was resting on its side. "So how do we make it right side up again?" Hedger asked. "The hard way," Rex replied. Soon the four of them began trying to push the truck upright again while Daedalus remained mumbling at the side. But it was no use. After half an hour of wasting their breath, Hedger finally came up with a bright idea. They used a few large logs from nearby and formed a sort of lever system. But it was still hard. The truck weighed a ton, and it took nearly 2 whole hours for it to be brought back on its wheels. Achilles checked inside, and luckily the keys were still there. The driver had just left it there while running away from the Manticore. Or maybe the driver was killed by it. Maximus did not know. Achilles sat in the driver's seat and placed the key in its keyhole and said, "Pray to the gods that it starts." Maximus thought these were a very poor choice of words, as their patron god was the one who was trying to hunt them down. It took a few turns, but the truck did start. "Excellent," Achilles said. Then he turned to Maximus and asked, "Can you drive?" He nodded yes. "Good, then we can take shifts driving this thing," Achilles said. They all stepped out to get some more water from the stream and freshen up a bit before the journey. They also managed to scavenge a few things like 2 extra containers of petrol, a first aid kit with healing potions and emergency provisions from the wrecked armored car, They loaded everything into the back, and before going in, Rex held Maximus and Hedger back and said, "This is it, guys. If we get in now, there's no turning back. We could be walking into a world of trouble." Maximus got into the truck and said, "I guess there's only one way to find out." This has been a chapter from Book 1 of the new World Odyssey series, The Soldiers of Ares. Links to the books in the bio. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this chapter, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. See you in the next chapter.